I'd like to introduce Katie Metzler, Vice President of Social Science Innovation at Sage, to kick us off with a brief introduction to today's event. Over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everyone. It's really nice to see all of the good days and hellos in the chat. And I can tell we've got people joining us from all over the world, which is fantastic. So welcome. As Kate says, I'm Katie Metzler. I'm VP for Books and Social Science Innovation at Sage. And thank you for joining what is the 4th Critical Thinking Bootcamp hosted by Sage. Since we started the Critical Thinking Bootcamp in 2020, it's become even more apparent that critical thinking is one of the most essential life skills that we can be equipping students with. So it's fantastic to be able to devote this time today to discussion and knowledge sharing. I think it's fair to say that the big tech news of the last 6 months has really been the explosion of generative AI and large language models. And already ChatGPT, Midjourney, and other AI tools and large language models that power them have had a huge impact on how content is produced and how information is disseminated. These new technologies hold great promise in boosting productivity and accessibility. And as an almost daily user of ChatGPT, Bing AI, Claude, and Code Interpreter myself, I've certainly benefited hugely already from the personal productivity gains afforded by generative AI. And I've had, I think I'd call them moments of genuine wonder at the capabilities of these tools and the opportunities that they provide. But LLMs and AI tools more generally also pose new challenges, especially when it comes to misinformation. So for users looking to LLMs for accurate answers, they need to be aware of hallucinations or the tendency for LLMs to make up information and present it as fact. And for those who are looking to actively mislead, generative AI tools act as misinformation and disinformation engines. They really make it possible to generate tons of content much more quickly and cheaply. And that's something we all need to be very aware of. So in this environment, I think students need to know how to question the information generated by ChatGPT and other LLMs, but they must understand the limitations of these tools and the risks associated with them, I think, while learning to harness their power in beneficial ways. So today's event is focused on the integration of generative AI tools in higher ed in a way that taps into its potential to help develop critical thinking skills. So there's been a lot of coverage of the negatives around LLMs in education, most notably the very real fears about cheating, the risks to standard assessments, and the impacts on academic integrity. But there's also pockets of really great work happening already within higher education that needs to be shared too, so that we can all learn how generative AI can be used in teaching, can provide personalized learning experiences, and can help students develop skills of argumentation and critical thinking. So Sage is really very proud to be able to provide events like this one, which I hope will allow us all to have some space to share examples of experimentation and some of the emerging best practice. As an independent company dedicated to supporting student success, we're free to invest in developing resources that anticipate future higher education needs and encourage the development of critical thinking skills. And we're really deeply invested in helping students learn the skills not only needed to succeed in the classroom, but the skills they need to be thoughtful citizens who can positively impact society. And our hope is that today we will provide insights to support you as you support them. So thank you again for joining the Critical Thinking Bootcamp, and I hope you enjoy the event. I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you. And so with that, I'll hand back over to Kate.
Thank you, Katie, for that resounding call to why critical thinking matters and why we're putting it at the heart of so much of what we're doing at Sage at the moment. I'm delighted now to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Lowe. Dr. Lowe is Dean and Professor of the College of University Libraries and Learning Services at the University of New Mexico, where he guides library operations and university programs. Dr. Lowe is a recognized author and speaker on the topics such as library science, leadership, and education. His focus on AI's role in library services and information literacy initiatives led to his current leadership role in UNM's AI literacy effort. As the president-elect of ACRL, Dr. Lowe continues to champion the advancement of academic libraries and their critical role in higher education. We are deeply honoured to have him here with us today. Welcome, Dr. Lowe.
Well, thank you, Kate, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen first. If you are able to see it, give me a thumbs up. Yep, okay, great. Thank you for having me here to share some high-level thoughts on this, I'll say, pretty hot topic. I think we are at the beginning of a transformative moment in education as we witness the rise of generative AI tools. So these systems like OpenAI's ChatGPT or DALL-E can create content that seems almost indistinguishable from what a human might produce, thereby reshaping our learning environments. By the way, all the images in my presentation today were generated by another generative AI tool called Midjourney, like Katie mentioned earlier, and this specifically for each slide. So you can let me know what you think about, how he does. So with all this generative power at our fingertips, a question arises: what role does human critical thinking play now? So the answer is more crucial than ever. And I think it's the key that turns all this AI potential into meaningful, contextual, and insightful educational content. So generative AI isn't just a tool to automate tasks, but an asset that amplifies our educational capabilities. In a landscape teeming with AI-driven outputs, human critical thinking remains paramount. Why? Because it allows us to shape, direct, and apply these AI generative narratives in ethically responsible and educationally relevant ways. So today, we focus on the synergy between generative AI's capabilities and the human intellect. So how do we ensure our students and educators harness generative AI in a manner that upholds academic integrity, promotes genuine understanding, and safeguards against misinformation? But before we delve deeper, let's first gauge the impact generative AI has had on our educational systems, its potential, and the unique challenges it brings. So since the public release of ChatGPT, I think since last November, the educational sector has found itself in a really unprecedented crossroads. This generative AI, with its ability to produce comprehensive content based on prompts, has introduced both opportunities and challenges that we couldn't have fully anticipated. So instructors are now grappling with the implications of this tool. How does one teach when AI can provide answers at the drop of a hat? And it's not just about answers. Generative AI can help them design courses, suggest readings, even assist in drafting research. So the potential is immense. Now for students, the game has changed as well. With ChatGPT, assignments can be completed without the traditional learning process. Now, this might sound amazing to some students, but it also bypasses the crucial stages of comprehension, analysis, and synthesis. So we're faced with the questions: are we preparing students for a world where information is abundant, but understanding might be superficial? So this new paradigm brings us back to a foundational question. If AI can do so much of the work, what becomes of critical thinking? Is it rendered obsolete, or does its importance amplify? To address this, well, let's first unpack the critical skills that are more indispensable than ever, especially in this era where AI tools like ChatGPT can transform traditional learning pathways. So in this new world where generative AI tools are reshaping our educational landscape, it is crucial to identify and hone the skills that remain uniquely human and that amplify our ability to use AI effectively. So first is analytical thinking, and I would say prompt engineering in there. I know we have a panel on prompt engineering later, so I'm really excited about that. While AI can generate information, humans are tasked with the discernment of what's relevant and valuable. Now, prompt engineering, I think, has become a critical skill, allowing us to frame questions and guide AI in ways that lead to meaningful answers. It's about understanding nuances, seeing connections, and thinking beyond the obvious. And then there's AI literacy. At this point, all of us are just at the very, very beginning. None of us really know what it is. But in this age, understanding how to interpret, analyze, and question AI-generated data becomes really important. And it's not just what the AI shows, but what it might be obscuring or what it might be leading us. Another important skill set is ethical reasoning. AI operates on algorithms, but it's up to us to ensure that its usage is in line with our values. We must understand the ethical implications, potential biases in AI output, and the broader societal consequences of AI-driven decisions. And then finally, continuous learning. As AI evolves, so must our understanding of it. So this calls for a commitment to lifelong learning, staying updated with technological advancement and adapting our strategies accordingly. So it's clear, while AI has the potential to be a powerful tool in our educational toolkit, it's our critical skills, including something like prompt engineering, which is a new skill set, the ability to formulate problem statements, to articulate what we want from AI, to evaluate AI's output, and to refine and adapt. That determines how we navigate and leverage this tool to its really utmost potential. So now that we have established the importance of these skills, the question arises, how do we foster and cultivate them in our educational setting? So let's look at some of the more practical strategies next. I think we need to, grow an AI literate generation. Engaging with AI in our educational setting necessitates a foundational understanding of several key areas. So understanding AI's capabilities and limitations. So we need to recognize that while AI can analyze a vast amount of data really rapidly, its output is really just as good as the input it receives, including both the data it's trained on and also the prompt that we feed it. So emphasizing this point aids, students and educators alike in realizing that the tool is potent, but it's not infallible. And also continuous learning and upskilling. So the landscape of AI is really evolving very quickly. Today's ChatGPT might be tomorrow's outdated tech. So this requires a commitment from educators, from students to really stay abreast of the latest advancement and ensure that we are making the most of the tools at our disposal. And like I said earlier, ethical consideration in AI deployment. So going beyond just using AI is vital to grasp the broader implications. How might AI suggestions impact societal beliefs, where biases lurk within its algorithms? So embedding these discussions into our curricula ensures a more holistic understanding of the tech that we are employing. So in essence, while we venture further into this AI augmented educational landscape, the focus areas ensure that we are navigating with both caution and informed enthusiasm. For example, at my university, my college is now developing the first AI literacy class for students, offering in the fall semester, a very short kind of 8 weeks course that a lot of people are really interested in. So we're hoping that with that, we can start educating students on understanding what AI is about, because we know that employers are really looking for that kind of skill set moving forward. So we need to prepare our students. But first, we need to prepare our faculty as well. So we're working really hard to provide, guidance, support for our faculty so that they can make the informed decisions on how or whether to use these AI tools in their classes. So as we understand these areas, it begs the question, how can educators and librarians drive these conversations, both in the classroom and kind of in the larger institutional setting? So I think we can be the resource curators. Librarians with our expertise in curating vast amounts of information are really perfectly positioned to compile comprehensive lists of AI tools, tutorials, and relevant reading materials. We can guide students and educators towards the best and the most ethical AI resources My library, and I've seen other libraries already started a lot of really great LibGuides that are really curating a lot of resources. So I'm really excited about that. We need to be AI literacy advocates. Both librarians and educators should be on the front lines of promoting AI literacy. We can ensure that users are not only technologically proficient, but also critically informed, helping them discern the quality and relevance of AI outputs in a way that, we've talked about misinformation or hallucination of these AI tools. The information discovery process has changed already, with Bing using these or Google using these systems to help do searches. We know that it requires a lot more of our information literacy, training to help people discern the information that they get in the future. We should be collaborative hubs. Our educational institutions have become dynamic centers of, AI group learnings. We can facilitate spaces where students can collaborate on projects using AI tools and learning about the best practices. In a way, we are kind of proposing a AI literacy lab at our university. It's a very early stage, but we're thinking about that. And I hope other people would also, take the lead on, some of these efforts. And we need to be ethics discussion leaders. One of the most crucial roles, by leading discussions about the potential biases and broader societal implications of AI, we can embed ethical considerations at the heart of these AI tool deployment. So you see the influence of AI in critical thinking. Librarians and educators, we're not just bystanders, we are pivotal guides, and we can be pivotal guides in shaping how the next generation engages with AI. So with this reshaped roles of educators and librarians in mind, let's envision, the immediate steps institutions can undertake to champion this integration. So the road ahead, how do we empower future thinkers? I think AI literacy is really essential. The assumption that AI will simply replace the need for critical thoughts is over a little bit misguided at this point. I think our teaching will need to emphasize AI literacy, ensuring students have the knowledge and skills to critically assess AI outputs and challenge biases, and then co-create, alongside these really, powerful tools. So it's not just about usage, it's about understanding and interaction. Like I said, moral and ethical boundaries. While AI can offer these, data-driven outputs, it does not and really cannot make value judgments, at least at this point. So the human aspect of ethics and morality becomes even more important. And we must instill in our students the ability to discern AI-generated content and guiding its potential. Embracing uncertainty, AI will continue to push the boundaries of what we know and understand. As educators, our task is to prepare students not just for the world as it is, but for a future filled with unknowns. So that means fostering adaptability, resilience, and a problem-solving mindset. And we need to promote lifelong learning. This is changing so fast, the emphasis on continuous learning becomes really non-negotiable. So the goal, developing individuals who are not just reactive, but proactive in their pursuit of knowledge, constantly updating their understanding in this dynamic digital age. So in closing, standing here and thinking about the trajectory of education, I'm reminded of the milestones that's transformed our landscape. Think of the revolutionary impact of, let's say, the printing press a long time ago, or the dawn of the internet that's really reshaped our classroom. And this is the next frontier. So I think one thing stands out. AI doesn't diminish the importance of critical thinking. I think it emphasizes it even more. Imagine it this way: if AI is the orchestra, critical thinking is the conductor, and ensuring that every note, every instrument is in harmony is kind of our guiding principle in this kind of digital symphony. So let's go beyond mere integration. Let's champion a transformative approach to education, where AI tools are used to deepen and enrich learning, not replace it. Because when it's all said and done, we're not just teaching for the present moment, we're really preparing future thinkers and leaders for dynamic AI influenced future. So thank you for being part of this pivotal conversation. Let's shape the future together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe, for a beautifully framed introduction to the day. You've laid out the building blocks for this event today perfectly, making a really clear case for how important it is to understand AI's transformative power in education, whilst also recognising the sort of enduring value of human critical thinking as well, and the need for education and the need for understanding. So thank you so much for kicking us off so wonderfully. Just going to see if we've got some questions for you, because I see a lot was coming through on the chat. So your first question for today, how will we create policies to prevent the misuse of AI, since it's evolving and different countries may have different approaches?
That is so true. We're kind of seeing different countries proposing different ways to regulate. EU is kind of a little bit ahead. I think US are definitely, we're working on it. And I've looked at the Canada policy and the China policy as well. So, and they're all slightly different. You know, some of them put more emphasis on privacy, some on the risk factor, like the EU one. So, and I think that would affect everyone, really. If you think about a company needing to be a global player, but they need to satisfy all these different kind of policies. So I can see that evolving, but none of them is like law yet. So it's still proposal. So I think we can all kind of shape it in a way that we can kind of give them our input and feedback. And a lot of organizations are doing that. And then at the cover, the next level is that we look at how, you know, institutions or even states, you know, are kind of working out how to guide our either employees or citizens on using it. I think several universities have come up with their own kind of guidance, like Harvard has just released this, and the Russell Group in the UK have done that as well. So I think more and more we'll see, you know, institutional guidance, and like I said, that we may even we have more of a say in that as well. So I would encourage all of us to be AI literate, you know, as soon as possible, so we can help shape that.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And another question that's come in that's sort of related as well is, what are some concrete strategies for assigning outside the classroom essays that make use of AI? Or do you recommend emphasizing in-class short writing projects?
I think at this point, I encourage trying different things. The only thing I don't recommend is not addressing it in class. I think we're putting both faculty and students in tough positions if we don't say whether they can use it or not, because they don't know at this point, and what is cheating, what is not cheating. So it really depends on how the assignments are structured, right? So at this point, let's experiment a little bit, you know, people are really creative and imaginative. And I think by having so many people try a new thing, we can learn very quickly. It's almost like crowdsourcing in a way. So I would say try different ways of doing it and then share it. One of the things I would like to do at my university is to have kind of almost like an AI empowerment initiative, to create several, you know, communities of practice so that people can share. People, you know, instructors from different disciplines can share what they have tried, what they have learned, and we can grow from it. This is a very interesting period where nobody knows anything, to be honest. Yes, we want to prepare the students, but at the same time, we need to prepare the instructors also. So I'll just encourage trying different things and sharing them.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that. So I think we're going to have to leave it there for now. There are so many questions coming through the chat for you. So we'll try and get those to you so you can answer them. Lots of interest from people really wanting to find out more about the class you're running and how you've been kind of structuring that. Who will be involved? Is it professor run or is it completely run by AI? So sort of lots of great discussion happening on the chat now. So thank you so much for starting us off today so wonderfully. So next up, we are going to be moving on to our first panel for today. And that's on asking the right questions, prompt engineering as a tool for critical thinking. I'm very pleased to give a warm introduction to our first panel of speakers. You can learn more about them on our event page. The link will be put into the chat so you can click on that. We have Meredith Schwartz, Managing Editor of CQ Researcher, Dr. J. Michael Spector, Professor of Learning Technologies at the University of North Texas, Dr. Madeline Mejia, Sage Author and Assistant Professor of Literacy and Reading Education at California State University, and Dr. Raymond Punn, Academic and Research Librarian at the Older Graduate School of Education. This is an exceptional breadth of expertise from academia, research, faculty, and the library. Should you have any questions or comments for these experts, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll try and cover as many questions that we can at the end of the session. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Well, in a very appropriately meta way, I became moderator of this panel, not because I have the answers, but because I asked the questions. I was working with Yvette to figure out what panels were really most important for us, and this was one that I thought we really needed to dive into. I'm going to say briefly a few words and then hand it over to my much more knowledgeable colleagues. Before I came to Sage as managing editor of CQ Researcher, I was editor-in-chief of Library Journal, so I have always looked at things from a library-centered perspective, and one of the things that I think is very important for us to remember is that the library can serve as the convener that Dr. Lowe was talking about for the disparate campus experts on the various aspects of AI. So we have on campuses the people who wrote these programs or developed them, study how they work. There's deep knowledge in the computer science and data science departments about how AI works. And there's deep knowledge in the sociology and public policy and political science departments about the cultural impacts that it's having. And there's deep knowledge in the education departments about how it's affecting learning. I agree with Dr. Lowe that there's still a lot we don't know. Nonetheless, I think if we could convene these multidisciplinary people who don't always have time to talk to each other into one sort of AI think tank at the campus level, and I think the library is the natural place to convene and host that conversation. And we can find out that the pressing questions from one set of people, there may already be incipient answers in a different set of people, but they're not necessarily talking to each other or able to digest each other's scholarly literature. So that's one of my main points. I did also want to emphasize that as great as ChatGPT is, and my colleague Katie showed me a very impressive data analysis yesterday, it's not the whole world of AI. It's not even the whole world of generative AI. There's a lot of scholarly specific tools, Semantic Scholar, Elicit, Cite, Scholarsy, the popular Chat PDF. And I feel, again, echoing Dr. Lowe, that making students and faculty and graduate students who are both aware of these specialized, less well-known tools that may be more suited to their needs is definitely a library role. It's sort of like weaning people off of Google search and teaching them how to use discovery layers. You know, that there's a lot of great power in Google, but there's also a lot of great power in solving one problem really well instead of trying to solve every problem. And AI has potential there. I also want to broaden out beyond generative AI to say how much pure pattern seeking in data power there is in AI, and not to have us neglect that in the large language model rush. Our digital humanities colleagues have long been using AI to find patterns in the corpus that no human would ever live long enough to detect. Now in the hard sciences, there are people detecting cancer that humans would never find just by the ability to look at so many things at such a fine level of detail. Large language models have the buzz now, and I'm not saying that's inappropriate, but I think that it'll serve us all to think about the whole picture of AI and not only the generative part, especially since it's the generative part that has that hallucination issue, and a lot of these other uses of AI do not. So that was most of what I wanted to talk about. I know my colleagues are going to address a lot of other points. One last thing is that as we're convening conversations on how to teach about this, and we need to convene examples from various departments. I see a lot of people talking about, well, this is how we learn to use calculators, and this is how we learn to use computers, and that's very appropriate. But I also think if we look to the arts, we'll see how did printing change learning? How did collage change learning? How did sampling change learning? That there on the art side also we have had your automated technologies really changed the game. And I think that there's learning to be drawn from on that side too. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first of our panelists, Dr. Michael Spector.
Oh, thanks. I think someone else is going to control my slides, or I can. Oh, okay, there it is. Yeah, so I'm a professor at the University of North Texas. I've been there, I don't know, about a dozen years, and I've been in other places around the world. My focus is on critical thinking, and it's going to be a little bit different from things that others might have to say, because I think, and traditionally, and it seems like in this meeting, the emphasis is on university and college students and adult learners. And that's been the focus of most of my work over the years, except that I've decided recently that that's a mistake with regard to critical thinking, so that critical thinking needs to be learned at an early age. And if young children don't learn critical thinking skills, it's really almost too late for a great number of them when they get to college and become adults. So let's go to the next slide. And I have some precursor remarks to make here, just reminders how I think about learning. And I think learning involves stable and persistent changes in what a person or group of people can do. So learning is a human oriented activity, and the things that I'm going to talk about, I'm not talking about machine learning. So technology and engineering involve a systematic application of knowledge for a purpose that's valued by a community or by various people. So that seems an ordinary approach to the definition of technology and engineering. And since science in general is engaged in systematic advances, and then how does critical thinking figure into this? So I've already told you my bias. I think critical thinking is primarily a human activity aimed at achieving understanding. And we can go to the next slide. So the next slide. So I'm going to draw on things I get from John Dewey. So the book, early book written in the first part of the previous century, How We Think, is freely available from the Gutenberg Press at the URL there. And I've extracted some of Dewey's thinking is that we learn basically based on experience and prior experiences. So education is aimed at developing thinking skills. So education should be based on having appropriate experiences to develop those skills. And yet much of education, the way I see it, it's based on thinking about the experience that other people have had rather than having one's own experiences. And this, the further we get into education, this becomes more and more true, and we're relying on the experience of others rather than our own, although reading is a kind of experience. So I have some questions of conscience for the people that might be listening in. And this is what I think of when I'm teaching a class. Why do you want to learn this? Why are you signed up for this course? What's it going to lead to? And a lot of people will say, well, I just want to get the degree, or I want to get a better job. And that seems somewhat inadequate. So what do you really want to learn? What do you want to understand that you do not understand now? And then where do you typically learn? Do you learn in the classroom? Do you learn at home? Do you learn in interactions with your colleagues? And who is it that you really want to become? So those are the questions of consciousness that I think we need to get our learners to be asking for themselves. And so the way I think about learning is learning is not about, and supporting learning is not about asking questions. To be a learner is to have questions. And to have a question means that, first of all, you admit that you do not understand. So you want to understand something that's not clear or that you have not encountered previously. I don't understand. So that implies a search, a kind of a set of experiences that are likely to lead to some deeper understanding of what you don't understand now. And then you have to consider alternative answers. So learning is about having questions, not about asking questions or giving answers. It's about the search. It's about having questions, admitting that you don't know, and then trying to find out. So off of the soapbox and on to the next slide. So the next slide is the things that I initially provided when asked to participate in this group. So my notion of critical thinking, I have a quick and easy definition here. It's a process of gathering, evaluating, and consolidating evidence in order to reach some conclusion with regard to something that's not previously understood, and in which you might have a high degree of confidence in that conclusion. So who engages in critical thinking? I've already given you my bias. Some people do some of the time, too little of the time. And so the question is, do machines engage in critical thinking? Well, machines can gather, evaluate, and consolidate information and evidence, and they might even provide a conclusion. But what machines lack is confidence. They can give you a degree of the likelihood of the conclusion being true, but that's not confidence. Confidence is the willingness to act on the conclusion, the willingness to stake your reputation on that conclusion, and the willingness to be wrong. And so machines lack those aspects of confidence. So when you reach a conclusion, who do you credit? Do you credit yourself? Do you credit others? Do you credit a computer? Well, who would a computer credit? Well, do they actually offer credit? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So people that make wrong conclusions or misleading conclusions often suffer consequences. What about AI programs that offer misleading information or make mistakes? Do they suffer consequences? Well, they might be turned off or they might be reprogrammed. That's not the same as going to jail or whatever consequences a person might suffer. So the real question is, how do we teach people to become better critical thinkers? And my answer here is this has to start early. And I think middle school students are ready. They can read and write. And so that's the time to start. And it's not going to happen in one course. It's not going to happen in an 8-week course. It's not going to happen in a 1-semester course. It's going to take years to develop critical thinking skills, but we have to start early. So that's the main point I'm trying to make. So we can make computer programs reach better conclusions over time, but then we have to think about, what are these computer programs designed to do? Are they designed to replace what a human previously was doing? I call that strong AI. So we're replacing that person that was performing this quality control activity at some manufacturing place with an AI program that's going to do a much better job. That's strong AI. We're going to replace the human. Weak AI is using computers to help individuals become better at doing things that they're asked to do. And so I think the future and the emphasis should be on weak AI, but that's not where the money is. That's not where the research is going. And so that bothers me quite a bit. So a weak AI program would be designed to help me be a better teacher, or help me write better papers, or do something better, be a better father or grandfather. So what happens when a person is unable to reach a conclusion? That's when they might engage in a search. That's when they might start actually learning something. Oh, I don't understand this. And now I have to learn, I have to do more investigation. What does a program do when it's unable to reach a conclusion? Does it engage in a new search? Does it refine the question? Does it ask an expert? Does it ask for help? I don't have an answer to that. I don't know enough about AI to give an answer to that. How do we tell the difference between a human critical thinker and a computer program? So some of you might be older than dirt like me, and remember, this is an old question that dates back to Alan Turing, who said, if you cannot tell if the answer is coming from a machine or an expert, you would have to argue that that machine is intelligent. So that's called the Turing test. And I once tried to perform a Turing test when I was a senior scientist at an Air Force Human Resources Laboratory and designing learning for aviation aircraft technicians. And so I had a person design a course and I had a computer design a course. But it was easy for the people that were engaged in the Turing test to tell which one was done by a human and which one was done by a computer. The human course took months to create, and the computer course took minutes to create. So that was easy to tell. Okay, that one's a computer. It only took a couple minutes. Whereas this other one looks really impressive, but it took months to create. We'll take the fast and easy, quick and dirty one, and we don't have to pay that computer any salary either. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now. I'll go to the next slide. I had a question on that last one. What would a modern Turing test look like? I think that's a question worth answering. But again, what I've been deciding to do since the early part of this decade is to focus on developing critical thinking skills. And I started with adult learners when I was at the University of Bergen in Norway, and didn't have a lot of success. And I thought, well, part of the reason is my methodologies weren't very good. And these people had already formed ways of acting and reacting that really went against how researchers had been talking about critical thinking skills. So that led me to think we have to start much younger. And so I was working with a Chinese company, NetDragon, who developed games for kids. And it turns out the CEO of NetDragon was interested in also developing critical thinking skills in those kids. When I pitched this to DJ Liu, who's the CEO of NetDragon, he asked me, when should we start? And I naively said around 13, because I knew some things about American kids, some math skills dropped off when they were around 13. And his answer to me was even younger. So he was on board, and I'm still working on that project. So that's my last slide, and I'll leave it there. And hopefully I've generated some questions. I hope you have questions, not that you ask questions, but you have questions, that you are willing to invest time and effort in a search for answers, not that you already know the answer, but that you're willing to consider alternatives and seek answers. So thanks for your time, and I'll pass to whoever's next. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Madeline Mejia, if you're willing to take the wheel.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you, Sage, for the invitation. So my name is Madeline Mejia. I'm a professor, I'm an assistant professor at Cal State Fullerton, and I teach in a master's program that prepares in-service teachers to become literacy experts. My background is in literacy. I was a classroom teacher myself. I taught in Boston. And so I'm very excited to be here. So next slide. So today I'm going to follow the conversation that we have started here and what Dr. Liu has shared and Dr. Spector. So I want to begin by defining critical thinking. I want to share with you the 6 skills and sub-skills that characterize a critical thinker. I'll share with you a paper that a colleague and I wrote that was recently published with Sage. And there we think about and we discuss how we need to leverage technology in general. And we focus on the function of AI in our preparing, teaching, and development of our students' critical thinking. And I'll provide some examples. Next slide. So this is the paper that was recently published. Next slide. So critical thinking is a process. So the literature, there are many definitions and perspectives and approaches about defining and thinking about critical thinking. But early on in the early 90s, a group of experts came together, the Delphi group, and described and talked about and looked at what are the critical elements of a critical thinker, or the characteristics that develop a critical thinker. And they came up with this process. The process is first identifying a problem, exploring the situation, formulating inferences, making decisions to arrive at new understandings, to then identify solutions. But notice how each of these steps in this process require multiple elements of thinking skills, critical thinking skills that really require thoughtful engagement, thoughtful discussions, thoughtful exploration of what we're looking at and how we are going to come up with a solution. Next slide. So these are the 6 critical thinking skills and sub-skills that the Delphi group identified. So there's interpretation, analysis, evaluation, inference, explanation, and self-regulation. And all of these, next slide, are taught in an integrated approach. So they're not taught as one skill in isolation. If we're analyzing, we're also interpreting, we're evaluating, we're explaining. If we're making inferences, we need to analyze, we need to interpret. We need to think about the information that's in front of us, right? We need to compare, contrast. And so when we're teaching critical thinking skills, all these scholars, their work, the literature shows that it requires an integrated approach. We need to have application and practice in real situations and across different contexts, different content areas. Next slide. So this is something that I've been thinking a lot about. You know, I use technology in my courses. When I was in the classroom, which was about 20 years ago, the extent of the technology that I used was having 2 desktops in my classroom. The internet was available, but it was not something that I used in my classroom to teach. The concept of a smart board was not existent in my classroom. But since moving into academia, I started thinking, you know, how and when should we use technology? To what levels, to what extent, and how do we leverage it? So I move away from using technology to really thinking about, critically thinking about, how do I leverage it? What's the intent? What's the function? And now that we are in this very exciting time with artificial intelligence, what is the function of AI? And again, where and when in my instructional sequence do I use it? Do I leverage it? Next slide. So I turn to these scholars. If you know, I'm a teacher educator. If you're familiar with Wiggins and McTighe, they use the backward curriculum design. And this is a process that educators use to first identify the desired results. So what is the big idea? What is the skill? What is it that I want to teach my students? And from there, I determine what will be the evidence that shows me with a culminating task, a project, a paper, whatever it may be, that shows that my students have learned that critical thinking skill or that big idea, that they've absorbed and taken in that concept. And from there, I begin to plan the learning experiences and the instruction, all the different learning events that will allow my students to practice what I'm trying to teach, that desired outcome, and for them to create that product that showcases their learning. Next slide. So if we're looking here at how we then promote and develop, support students' critical thinking skills, we need to begin with selecting the critical thinking skills to teach. And remember, this is an integrated approach. We're not teaching just one skill, we're teaching several of these skills because they all inform one another. We then need to determine the product that will demonstrate the use, our students' use of the critical thinking skill. And then finally, from there, we can determine when and how AI will be leveraged. What will be the role of AI in these learning events? Next slide. So using this format, this structure, this process, my colleague and I came up with this set of questions. So again, identifying the desired results, we have a guiding questions for educators to use to think about what is it that this teaching is going to create, this output. You know, what would be the acceptable evidence that showcases the types of critical thinking that my students are practicing and also engaging in to create this product. And then the last, 4 questions basically focus on 4 or 5 questions focus on what are some of the learning events or these learning experiences that my teaching will engage my students in. Now, I want you to pay attention to the last 3 questions. So how will my students be apprenticed to successfully participate in learning experiences using technology? And which learning experiences have I planned that can be extended with technology to help students practice the critical thinking skills taught? So again, here, technology, it's not the end, right? It's a support. It's something that I'm leveraging, I'm using strategically, I'm selecting with intentionality to engage my students in the type of thinking that I want to promote in my classroom, in my lessons. Next slide. So here's an example. This is actually a unit that took place in a first grade classroom. I conducted a study last year. This is part of a larger study, but part of it, since we were in this place, I thought, let's see how we can effectively, responsibly, how can I leverage AI in this first classroom space? And so our unit was like all first grade teachers. I was a first grade classroom teacher. We teach the life cycle of a plant, but let's take that to a greater theme. And so we looked at humans' relationships with plants and how plants influence humans. And so the learning objective there, the critical thinking skills that I was, teaching there, my students were practicing, was how students were analyzing humans' relationship with plants to then evaluate and explain how plants influence humans. And the outcome was a multicultural fair. And so think of this as a gallery walk design. So the fair took place in the classroom, and that was made up of different ways that we'd leverage technology. We can use slide decks to basically show the life cycle of a plant. And all of this requires guidance and teaching and instruction for students to do this. There were time-lapse videos with students' observations of a plant growing. There's illustrations and photographs of plants used as decorations, posters or infographics about the medicinal uses of plants, or Q&A interactive stations using iPads to learn about how plants are used for clothing, household items, or construction. Video interviews with family members to learn about the different ways that plants are used for food or any other purposes. And so again, I want to bring attention to the type of thinking skill, the critical thinking skill that's required to create each product. Next slide. And so here I break down the different types of thinking that's required for each product. And I only broke down 3 different, examples. So there's interpretation, there's analysis, there's making inferences, there's explanation. So if you think about a first grade classroom, we teach these skills to our students by modeling. We teach these skills by engaging in group conversations, in small group, in exploration. And all of that generates a lot of questions. We are all curious as human beings. We are curious beings. And so we need to leverage also that skill and that trait to continue to think about how we're learning this information and what we're practicing when we're learning, what critical thinking skills we're practicing. Next slide. So I would like to, I think there's a couple of slides that are not here, unfortunately, but I'll talk about them. So one of the things that I also did is I leveraged the use of ChatGPT and DALL-E. And I'm sorry that it's not here, but I can share my screen. I can share those. So one of the ways that I don't know, like, I don't think the slides moved, but so we went into ChatGPT and we asked a prompt and we said, here we go, make a poster about the life cycle of a plant. So this was, if we're talking about asking questions and prompt generation, which is a skill that Dr. Lowe talked a lot about, and there's a lot of conversation about prompt generation. So this is the prompt that we included in, and we asked ChatGPT. So there are many different structures or formulas, if you will, for prompt generation. And there's a lot of dialogue around this, but we use something very simple. Again, we're working with first graders. So we provided an action or a task, right? Make a poster about the life cycle of a plant. The format is a poster. The context was the life cycle of a plant. And so here's one, the first generated text that ChatGPT created. I'll put it. This is the next slide. Here we go. So here, notice that this is a version from ChatGPT that was out in January of this year, so January 2023. And so the title here is Plant Power, and it also provided a descriptor for an image. So the descriptor is a colorful illustration of a plant growing from a seed with a friendly and simple illustrations of different stages in the life cycle, including seed, sprout, stem, leaves, flowers, and fruit. I'm going to come back to that descriptor because that's what we use for DALL-E. And it provides a bulleted point steps of like, what is the life cycle of a plant? Well, this generated really good conversations for us to think about. Well, there's a lot of details here. And when we are thinking about identifying a main idea from this text, we know that plants are strong and they have power. But this also generated some questions. So bullet number 3 says leaves make food, flowers make seeds, and fruit has seeds too. Well, what about seedless grapes or seedless watermelons, right? Do they also make fruit? Do those fruits also make seeds? This was a good conversation to have with students to start thinking critically about the output of this LLM, and for us to think about whether this is all truth and whether there may be some information here that we need to go back and look more carefully at and question. So we clicked the regenerate response. And so we got this next output. Next slide. No, this is the image, sorry. Well, I'll talk about the image. So we used that descriptor, and this was the image that it outputted. And this generated also a lot of different questions. So is this a fruit or a flower? We weren't sure. Is this plant smiling? Are these arms or leaves? And why is the stem away from the root? Again, it allowed us to start engaging in conversations about the type of output that an AI such as DALL-E can generate, which could then lead us to think more carefully about what's in front of us and how we're thinking critically about this information, how we're looking at some of the misinformation, some of the information that could be confusing, that is confusing, and what we need to do to start really assessing and evaluating what's in front of us. Next slide. Okay, so this is the second. So I'm going to just take you back to the first generated AI ChatGPT output. And then when we clicked the regenerate response, this was the second one. So again, the descriptor for the image is the same. The title is different. It does provide details in the text bulleted point, but here the main idea was about plants being big and beautiful. There's a lot of detail about beauty. And then there was the third bullet, flowers make seeds for new plants, and some plants make fruit. And so that, again, because our students had sufficient background knowledge, we had talked about the life cycle of a plant, we had investigated, we looked at in different types of information. Conversations arose from, well, is mushroom a plant? Do mushrooms make fruit, right? So really good critical thinking and engagement about what this information presents and how we need to look at it more carefully. So next slide. I believe this is probably going to be that second. Yeah. So this is the second DALL-E image that generated. And so this one actually generates a lot more discussion and a lot more thoughtful criticism and evaluation about these outputs. So if we take a look at this here, we don't know, like these double-sided arrows, right? So which way does the life cycle of a plant start? Where does it go? Does it begin here? Does it go to the left? Does it go to the right? We're not quite sure. DALL-E also combines letters, symbols, lines, and creates its own language. So if we look closely here, this is not a language. This is just a combination of different lines and squiggles that looks like letters, that looks like words, but it's not a language. The other conversation we had too was, let's take a look at this yellow circle. Well, is this a fruit? Is that where if we were looking at the life cycle of a plant, is the fruit then generating a flower? We weren't quite sure. So again, this was a great image for us to analyze and think critically about output that AI creates. So next slide. I think some of my slides have moved around. If we can go back to a couple of the other slides when I talk about, again, the critical thinking process and a table that I have where I talk about what we should be doing as we move forward. One more, please. Here we go. So again, this is a very important time. It's an exciting time. I'm going to start and I'm going to say that I use AI. I use technology. I think we need to know how to use it. And the conversations we've all been having is how we need to be careful about what's in front of us and how we use it productively. So using these steps of a critical thinker, the characteristics of a critical thinker, just yesterday when I did this search, we know that ChatGPT, and I only looked at ChatGPT, there are about 60 million visits per day. And we don't know the length of time for that visit. We don't know if it's an hour. We don't know if it's 10 minutes. We don't know if it's longer than that. But let's think about how that is happening on a daily basis and how AI is shaping our future. So for identifying the potential problems that can come from that, we need to think about what we all know. There's biases, there's discrimination, there's misinformation and deep fakes. And although we call this, and the language we're using is hallucinations, let's call it what it is. There's bias, there's misinformation, there's deep fakes. There's a lot of potential harm that comes from this. There's also security vulnerabilities. It's our data, it's information that we're putting in, and it's information that is accessible, that is open. There's also a lack of regulation standards. And although across the world, we as human beings are engaging in different ways to organize and think about how we're going to regulate what's happening, there's also this whole machinery that's taking place that's developing the new iterations. We're going to have ChatGPT 5 or ChatGPT 6 or whatever next iteration of that will be, and as well as of all the other AI tools. So when we're exploring this situation, I would like for us to also think about the human-centered perspective or the humans in the loop. So using human intelligence to think about how we work with machines and having a very clear and thorough understanding of the ethical uses of AI, whether this is causing some codependence or has the potential to create some codependence. And if that codependence will undermine the development of a critical thinking skill. I believe that it's exciting that a tool exists that can help me analyze my data, a large data set. I love it. This is how I leverage a tool. But I also want to make sure that I'm also thinking about and I am analyzing that data so I'm not becoming codependent and that skill is not, going dormant. We also need to think about the malicious use of AI. And as we're thinking about this, some of the ways that I begin to formulate some inferences, and by no means this is an extensive list, this is basically some beginning introductory points. I think very carefully about when and how we should use AI. We need to think about and analyze the consequences of biased AI outputs and the short-term benefits and the long-term consequences. And so those consequences can be very positive and also can be not so positive and maybe very negative. So as we consider the impact, both positive and negative, of AI on society, I would like for us to continue to have these conversations. And I'm very excited that SAGE is doing this because we need to come to responsible decisions. And that only comes when we come together and we engage in these thoughtful discussion and thoughtful asking questions and thoughtful ways of engaging in critical thinking. Because, and I'll go to the slide at the end, which you already saw, one of the conversations that I've been having with colleagues is the amount of water that AI is using. And so recently, authors, researchers, scholars from University of Colorado Riverside, and I forget the other university, but you see the link at the bottom, the citation. They have published a paper, which is already out in the public. It has not yet been peer reviewed, but from their research, AI, for every 20 to 50 questions that one person asks, right? For every 20 to 50 questions, ChatGPT is drinking about 500 millimeters of water. So like a bottle of water. So think about those 60 million visits that ChatGPT receives per day. And we don't know the length of time for each visit. Let's just think about where we are in our world, right? We have all been experiencing a heat wave. And these servers require vast amounts of water to keep those servers cooled down. So let's think about, again, when and how we are using AI in very responsible ways in these short-term benefits and perhaps long-term consequences that we have not yet further explored. So thank you, everyone. I will pass it on to the next person.
Thank you so much. And the next person is Dr. Ray Pun. Ray, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all here. Thank you so much for making time to come to this Critical Thinking Bootcamp. My name is Ray Pun. I am an academic and research librarian at the Alder Graduate School of Education, which is a teacher's residency program in California. And I'm also a faculty member for the master's seminar. So our program is a one-year intensive master's program where we have pre-service teachers being engaged in thoughtful work as trying to become preschool to high school teachers in credentialing areas across California. And so I have had the opportunity to really engage with my students how to think about ChatGPT outputs and the issues that are arising that some of my colleagues have shared today. Next slide, please. Oh, the one to the left. Yes, so thank you. The agenda is for this talk, I'll be looking at the working statement, what that looks like to have a syllabus and have faculty engagement to get them all on the same page. And this is something that all of you might consider, which is having some sort of guideline or some sort of policy that's evolving as the technology is going so that everyone's on the same page and that there are no discrepancies in terms of usage or expectations. Next, I'm going to give you another example similar to what Dr. Mahia shared, how we interrogate the output that comes out through a ChatGPT in the classes that I teach. And then finally, some of the ethical concerns that were raised earlier, but also ones that I wanted to highlight as well. Next slide. So you see here this graphic. I know there were some questions in the Q&A about like cheating and plagiarism, and people are afraid of students avoiding critical thinking. But I think part of the other question is really rethinking the issue of what we mean about plagiarism and cheating within our system. This graphic came from Ditch That Textbook by Matt Miller. Ditch That Textbook is a nonprofit organization focused on pedagogy. And on the left side, it really gives you 3 questions for you to think about. Which of these would you consider cheating? Which of these is relevant to our students' future? And which of these would you consider you use in your work as an adult? And then it has a scale, right, from the top to the bottom, bot created and student created. And then it has these sort of nuances. And I think it's important to think about, first of all, like your expectations, your assignments. What are you trying to really get at? I know folks have said, oh, our assignments are going to be obsolete and we need to update them. Certainly that's true. Certainly all assignments is possible and vulnerable, right, at some point. And so when you think about this, you need to think about how do we scaffold tools that are coming in, tools that are unfortunately going to be part of the workforce for many industries and sectors. And how do we want to prepare our students, or in my case, teachers, how do we want to prepare them to think about these tools and the assignments and the system that we have created inherently, right? Plagiarism and cheating. So would it be cheating if students plugged in a prompt into AI, copied the response, and submitted it to a teacher that's bot created? Going all the way down to student create multiple AI responses, use the best parts, edit it, and submitted it. So there is sort of this fluctuation. And it's something that I think this graphic, if you were to have these conversations with your faculty or with your students, to really think about it, because it really is a conversation to be had. And some folks have said, oh, what about the types of assignments that you can do to be quote unquote AI proof? I wouldn't say these are AI proof. I rather would say they're more focused on critical reflection and critical thinking. So that might include video reflections, maybe some sort of statement on positionality and reflection based on the assignment. And most recently, I participated at a zines conference, right? So there might be ways to do something physical that does not involve something digital. So zines would be a great way to help create a DIY expressive sort of a periodical that focuses on a specific topic of interest. So there are definitely ways to sort of re-engage students, and that also utilizes skills to support their learning. But when we think about the systems, I think this is something we need to really reframe and think carefully. Next slide, please. So that means getting on the same page with faculty, colleagues, and departments. And for me, it was really, as a librarian, having those conversations with them, communicating that this tool is out there back in November and started picking up in January and February, and then in July, right? There's a new 4.0 coming in that arrived. And then creating and affirming those parameters and what they look like. And most importantly, understanding that the expectations are going to change and some of the assignments might have to change and tweak because we have assignments here, for instance, letters to the principal, if you're writing one, or some sort of other expository essay, right? But not all are going to be vulnerable because, as I mentioned, some of them are deeply reflective on their positionality and identity and teaching philosophy. And ChatGPT cannot explain specifically one's intersectional identities. Next slide. And so this is an example of a working statement for the syllabus that I have worked with a couple of faculty members and one student who happened to have a PhD in computer science, and she wanted to be a math teacher. So we all came up and discussed with our other colleagues, and we decided two main points. The first is that if you're going to use these tools, you should cite them in the citation style, which is APA. And if you're going to use these tools, make sure you paraphrase or quote them as you can, but mostly paraphrasing, because it's so important that they understand what the text is saying, what the output is saying. We're initially letting our course leads decide, but then now I think we're leaning towards having a consistency where it's allowed because we believe in innovation, but we also want to ensure that there are misinformation and content generated from this third-party site that can create some issues. So for example, ChatGPT back in May from OpenAI had a data breach. As Dr. Mejia shared, there are data breaches happening. And what does that mean if you are using this to write a reflection to help you outline your thoughts? If you came from a marginalized group, if you are trans, if you're coming from an undocumented family, what does that say about the data that's going to be out there? And you're writing about it. So we want to caution, obviously, our teachers who are going to be students who are going to be teachers on using this tool sensibly and ethically and being aware that there's going to be some flaws and issues. But the whole point is that this is a working statement that we put in there so that students understand that they will need to cite and paraphrase as they need to, if they choose to use it. Next slide, please. And I show you this from Keynes, who is an instructional technologist at Michigan, who wrote about if you're going to use this, right, for ChatGPT for your instruction, a few things to highlight here. Don't have them create a ChatGPT account because we don't know where that stuff is going, right? With the account, you need to put a phone number and email address, etc. And then there's already the data breach. So for me, I have created my own. I don't have my students use one. But we also, if they choose to use it on their own, encourage them to use a burner email account. So that reduces the tracking of personal data and privacy surveillance that's happening within OpenAI, which is a for-profit company. And if they use it for work or for personal. And of course, if it comes down to it, you can have a shared login account, right? And a burner account. So this is sort of like precaution if you're going to use it that I think might be helpful to like consider. Next slide, please. And so as my role as a librarian, we think a lot about ways to connect to framework. So there is the framework for information literacy, and it's an opportunity to think about how ChatGPT aligns, or like generative AI tools align with our thinking for information literacy. So I pulled out some of these frames and then some of the comments about each frame. So we're thinking about information creation as a process, right? We talked about using this tool as a way to scaffold, perhaps, especially those students who have learning differences or students who are emergent bilingual. It really certainly has helped. Even faculty members who experience those have shared with me that it's been really helpful to outline their thoughts. But we're thinking about bigger issues here for the library role, right? Like how do we have conversations about resources that are being produced by ChatGPT that are maybe not real, but maybe some are like, hallucinated, as we call it, or fake. And so like, how do we understand what that means in the scholarship world? How do we use research as an inquiry when we gather information and assess for gaps and weaknesses within tools like ChatGPT? And then how do we search, right? We're searching all the time, whether it's on Spotify or Instagram or Google or databases, and we're using ChatGPT too, right? How do we think about that as a way to search, as a way we put in our output? So I use this as my own way of thinking of engaging our students through the framework for information literacy. Next slide, please. So one of the recent assignments I had was a Zoom discussion with 6 graduate students, and they were in my master's seminar. And we talked about theories in education, such as culturally relevant pedagogy. And then I didn't tell them this, which is I used ChatGPT to create the output. And I wanted them to look at it because we just spent a whole time reading an article about culturally relevant pedagogy. And then we just wanted them to sort of look at this and see what's right, what's incorrect, and what can be like done better, right? And so in order to do that, I need to also frame the structure of the questions. So if you go to the next slide, you're going to be able to see some of these questions that I sort of put out there for them to think about. Is this random response that you see here, is it a fact or opinion? Does it leave out some information, voices or viewpoints to be considered that are not there? What are some of the flaws in the response's logic? What citations or references, right, support this claim? And then something more of a internal discussion, which is what are their thoughts on this response, right? Is it accurate? Is it something that they could connect with? And really thinking about this sort of tool, right? And how would they paraphrase it in their own words? And so we had some discussion about it, but in the next slide, you're going to see we ended up like breaking it down, right? They ended up telling me, oh, it's missing a theorist. It's missing specific examples. Can it give more sort of specific context to this? And then someone saying, oh, maybe we need to add a picture, or emphasizing some of the other areas that it's not really providing. And this, I will say, is from ChatGPT 3.5. 4.0 is much more sophisticated, right? And so it actually gets into the specifics of these other areas. But I thought, let me try 3.5 and like let them like look at it together and discuss it, right, after reading it. And so I think this is one way to really think about using this kind of output to have conversations and really to dig into citation practices, because this was during the lesson of like, how do you cite? How do you do APA? How do you paraphrase? So that they felt that they were applying the skills that they just learned into this kind of exercise. And so next slide. And so I'm kind of coming into this last part of the presentation, which is ethical considerations. You heard some of my colleagues shared earlier about their thoughts. And so I wanted to highlight some of the other areas that we need to think about. Obviously, the data breach, the privacy surveillance that's happening, it's certainly happening, surveillance. So this is tied to the data breach, but it's also one to think about. So people have started saying, and I started seeing some news articles about it, where they want to use a surveillance tool to examine, right, students' papers, right, and whether they use it or not. And I think that might create more of a surveillance culture that is kind of difficult to hold accountability and to address like the system questions that I asked, which is which part do you think is cheating and plagiarism and so forth. And so that's something to consider, right, the issue of surveillance culture. Do we really want to start doing more of this, even though it might be happening at your institutions with Turnitin or some other tools, right? But it creates more of a layer of concern. The environment, certainly that was shared earlier with water. We need to recognize the environmental impact of processing LLMs in large data centers affecting our environment. And so there's more data coming in to suggest these kinds of tools out there need huge servers and centers to do that. And it's creating environmental impact. Copyright. Some of these tools are, or I should say all of them, really scraping data, right? And there's proprietary information, and now there are lawsuits coming in from comedians such as oh gosh, the person who just released one recently. Her name just slipped out of my mind. Sarah Silverman. There we go. And so, like, we need to think about the implications of copyright, and this is a chance to have a conversation about what is copyright, what is proprietary, what is out there, right? So that we need to have these conversations framed in a way that is thoughtful for our students to take back. The labor issues. Certainly, there is human output at the very end where they moderate, and then they do sort of content managing. And I've seen this and I read articles about it, sort of laborers working in Kenya, highly severely exploited, underpaid, and creating these ChatGPT output, or like sort of flagging them. And so that's something to consider, right, and to think about. And then their biases, of course, the information, misinformation, all of that's coming out that may be inaccurate, may be problematic, may be something to really think about. And then it leads to confirmation bias too, right? Like, there's something that if we're looking at a prompt and then we're trying to fill things in, are we sort of doing some confirmation bias? That's something to be sort of understood further later, but also the idea of the biases that we have as people. So if you are an instructor and you're probably thinking, this student who I know for sure, you know, quote unquote, is not like a native speaker in English, they must have used ChatGPT. There's going to be some of these biases that will come up, right? And you have to really be aware of that and how it perpetuates the bias that's coming in through the system that's inherent in ourselves. So I kind of leave these sort of questions and considerations to think about. Certainly there are probably some other ones, but if you go to the next slide, that I'll just sort of wrap up here and say thanks again, and hope that was sort of informative and helpful. And feel free to take a look at the slide deck later, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ray. And Kate, I know we're over time. Do we have time to take some questions, or are we moving on?
We don't at this stage. We are up against time, but what we'll do is make sure that we provide answers for all of those questions, and we can circulate them after the event, if that's okay. Right. So do keep the questions coming. I just wanted to say thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Dr. Spector. Thank you, Dr. Mejia and Dr. Pun as well for such a great first session. There is so much discussion in the chat and so many questions. So like we say, we'll make sure we get those questions answered, circulated after the event. We're actually now going to take a quick 5-minute comfort break. I encourage everyone to get up and have a stretch or grab a snack. On screen, what you'll find is some networking questions to help you meet and connect with colleagues for a bit of fun and to hear about other experiences. I encourage you to use the chat box to share your answers and to learn from others in our virtual chat room today as well. We will begin our next session shortly. So we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back at 31 minutes past. Thank you. And we are back. We will just take a few moments just to get settled and make sure everyone is here. And so next up is our second panel, fact-checking the Hive mind, detecting mis- and disinformation. As always, you can learn more about all of our speakers at the event page, which will be in the chat. Dan Chibnall, STEM librarian at Drake University, who has actually participated in all of our annual bootcamps so far, is joined by Dr. Brooklyn Gibson, an assistant professor of communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Gibson, we're excited to welcome you back for your second bootcamp. We also have Dr. Richard Wood, associate professor of practice, family studies and human development at the University of Arizona, and Dr. Richard Rosen, a retired professor at the University of Arizona. Feel free to post your questions or comments. We are all really eager to learn from this panel of experts. Now, let's welcome Dan, Dr. Gibson, Dr. Wood, and Dr. Rosen.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'm going to lead us off today, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. So we should take a little bit of time to tell you about what we do and our thoughts on these subjects. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So greetings, everybody. I'm Dan Chibnall. I'm the STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. I work closely with STEM faculty and students in the classroom. And I also teach standalone courses called Science Fiction, Science Fact, Fake News, Filters, and Falsehoods, Communicating Science, and Science Democracy. So as a STEM librarian, I wear kind of two big hats when it comes to instruction. I work closely with the science faculty as an embedded librarian and teaching one-shot sessions, focus on information ecosystems in the sciences. But then I also, over the past 7 years, have developed the courses that I just listed that focus a lot on information literacy, critical thinking, and how to basically, be better consumers, analyzers, and users of information. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today telling you about what we do in those courses and how they kind of relate to critical thinking, AIs, chatbots, and where we go from here. So I'm going to start with my course on misinformation stresses to students that this is not a new phenomenon. It's just been repackaged and sort of repurposed using new technology in the 21st century. We focus a lot of our work in that course on ideas that you can't necessarily fact check your way out of trouble when it comes to mis and disinformation. What I tell the students is that fighting these kinds of false pieces of information require more of a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. These problems are not going to go away if we just sort of buy the perpetrators of poor information a subscription to a quality newspaper or cite a journal article at them. That's not going to work. Mis and disinformation are symptoms of something deeper. They are often the result of people acting out of their deeply held beliefs in something pseudoscientific or dangerous or not grounded in reality. Fighting back against it means speaking up for truth and data and evidence and reality, and talking about truth and not letting noise sort of inhabit the void. When you let those kinds of things sort of inhabit the silence, it starts to grow. So ChatGPT and AI are going to make this even worse because now that we're using them and they're sort of these black boxes, we have to be careful and know what they're doing and how they work, because there are ways to use them to help us organize or to brainstorm or to think, but we can't become over-reliant on them. We can't offload all of our thinking or our skill building onto these things. So we have to be able to make sure that we can sharpen the tools in our toolbox when it comes to information literacy and critical thinking, and not just sort of let the chatbots do that work for us. One of the scholars we focus on in this course is Mike Caulfield from the iSchool at the University of Washington. And he has some of the best techniques for how to sort of live and work within a growing world of misinformation and AI. And his web literacy for student fact checkers, which is available at the Open Textbook Library, is really helpful for students, giving them ideas about how these things work, sort of taking them apart, understanding what lateral reading means, understanding how to track things back to their sources. And these things are just as important 5 to 10 years ago as they are now when we're using things like chatbots and AI. My course on science communication focuses on a number of things, including the dangers of scientific mis and disinformation, how to recognize it, how to communicate it better to people so they understand it and are interested in it. And one of the phrases that we use a lot in my course is how to make the invisible visible. And by that, I mean, in order to make people more aware of the science around them, you have to kind of bring it out of the shadows. You have to shed light on it, and you have to sort of bring it somehow locally to them, something that they'll understand. And in a way, ChatGPT and AI are very similar. They're mostly invisible. We don't really know exactly all their inner workings, right? That's what the black box problem, right? And so when we're using them, we have to keep that in mind. Just like when we use any other tool, we have to understand how it works and not just say like, well, it does work. It seems like it, so it might as well just keep using it, right? So in other words, the chatbots and the AIs are kind of keeping certain doors and windows closed to us and out of sight. So we don't even know what we're missing. And so we have to remember that when we're using tools like that we're not always seeing the big picture. And, just a few things about that. Scientists have started to report on how inaccurate ChatGPT and other AI programs can be, noting false citations, made up papers, trails of pseudo information that lead away from ChatGPT. I just read a tweet this morning by Dr. Eric Topol, who he was referencing a new article in JAMA that shows just how often ChatGPT, the different versions of it, cites false articles. And it's not getting really any better. If there's a scientific topic that's made it into the mainstream news, there's at least one counter story that sort of catches on with the public. And if people start searching for that and using ChatGPT as a search engine, they're going to run into problems trying to find actual information. Another example is I saw one physicist ask ChatGPT about a made-up subatomic particle. Didn't exist, and ChatGPT just ran with it and pretended like it was real. And the scientists, it even had these fake papers that were referencing the fake subatomic particle. So what happens when that just keeps snowballing, right? And, if you don't think that this is going to happen elsewhere, Google has already begun to use its AI in search results. And you can now turn it on in using Google Labs in your Google Docs. So it will help you write something or help you, just write within a Google Doc. So this stuff is coming to our neighborhoods and to our doorsteps. It's not just far away in the chatbot itself. Some of the other things I try to identify when I'm working with students on these kinds of things relate to things like cognitive biases and the loss of discovery. I make sure that students understand that when we use these tools, we often fall prey to confirmation bias. And we've seen this already for decades now with social media, things like the recency bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what I mean by loss of discovery is, because we have more and more digital tools that provide us with information, we do less and less work to discover information. We basically kind of set up an autopilot of, some other tool doing the work for us. And so when we do that, we're losing the ability to do it on our own. We're basically just sort of offloading these skills to something else. So then when students go out into the workforce, it's like, well, how do you separate yourself from other prospective, employees? If anybody can use ChatGPT, how are you any different, right? What do your skills look like? What tools are in your toolbox? Anybody can do a Google search, and now anybody can do a ChatGPT search. How do you stand out, right? And I'll just end my comments today too, telling you a little bit about, I teach a course called Science and Democracy. And so we sort of look at what roles do mis and disinformation play within the sciences, but also within democratic politics, small d, not the party, but the concept. And so we talk a lot about, how mis and disinformation lead people down the wrong paths, and they think that they live in a certain political reality when they don't. And we're going to start seeing people use chatbots and AI to sort of reinforce some of those already falsely held beliefs. So it sort of becomes fruit of a poison tree. And then it just snowballs from there. So, one of the last tips I'll give that I often do with my students is I tell them to think about, we do a lot of activities on where is your information coming from? So we'll look at something in social media or a news item or something like that, and we try to trace it back to the source, right? And I also get students to think a lot about, to build that habit, I also get them to think about what I call information moods. So we take in information at different times of the day. We seek information at different times of the day. what's our mentality like at that time of the day? Are we ready to read a deep article, or are we just going to kind of skim the surface of Twitter or something like that? So I think it's important for students to really recognize when and how they do these different information habits and how ChatGPT and AIs figure into those information moods. So I will finish there to make sure we all have plenty of time. And I believe I'm now handing it off to Dr. Richard Wood. And I believe you're muted, Dr. Richard Wood.
There we go.
There we
Thanks,
go.
Dan. As
No
I
problem.
said before, thank you so much. I really liked your comment about habits, because it leads to some of the things that I do in a classroom. I teach a class here at the University of Arizona called Critical Thinking that Dr. Rosen has also taught. And what I'm going to focus my attention on today are some tips that have been useful in the past in teaching this course. So this is basically some tips on teaching critical thinking to undergraduates. So next slide, please. Hello, there we go. So what I try to think about, or actually picture yourself in front of a class of this semester, probably 60 students that are all between the ages of 19 and 24. And many of the people on this presentation have do that as a daily basis. And what occurs to me is the most important thing that we have in trying to decipher truth versus non-truth, or accuracy versus non-accuracy in AI is the students themselves and the critical thinking of us as individuals. And a previous speaker talked about that this should really start in middle school, because the biggest problem we face is not AI, it's our own inabilities, as I see it in a lot of undergraduates, to do critical thinking, and to do it with a sense of skepticism versus cynicism. I don't know about the rest of you, but a lot of my students now are very cynical. They don't trust things that they see or hear, and are very hesitant to trust any, quote, truth unless it comes from their peers. So what I try to do is do a couple of these things about critical thinking skills without a very, long pedagogical, it does have a pedagogical foundation, but in other words, simple things that students can use. Now the problem, and this is a problem that nobody's mentioned, and maybe some other people will mention as well, is critical thinking, according to the neurosciences, is uncomfortable. It takes time. Your body actually changes. Your pupils become more dilated. Your galvanic skin response changes. It takes effort and it takes time. You've heard of system 1, system 2 thinking, etc. In my class, I call it whatever thinking versus a word that's gotten a very bad reputation, a rhetorical thinking. So that's the problem we face. And not many undergraduates that have been raised with smartphones, social media, and instant gratification are, some do, of course, voluntarily going to say, what's the veracity of this statement? I think I'm going to go do some research and find out. The problem is they don't. And how can we encourage them to do that? So here are a few quick critical thinking skills that I use in my class. The next slide, please, Erica. So one of them is come down the ladder of abstraction. And actually, the S.I. Hayakawa, way back when, if anybody's old enough to remember that, Thinking in Language, his book, is we are inundated with adjectives and adverbs. And what I recommend the students do, and we have exercises in class that do this, is we take it down the ladder of abstraction, throw away the adverbs, throw away the adjectives, and ask yourself, and what I have the students do is ask yourself, what are real people doing observable behaviors in real time? In other words, take it from the global theoretical as to what your sorority friend is doing. How does it affect in real time? For example, a student will say, well, I'm concerned about the environment. Well, yeah, we're all concerned about the environment. But then the question that I feed back is, so what does that mean to you? What are you willing to do? What environmental changes are you willing to take? So tip 1, I try to get them come down the ladder of abstraction. Tip 2, be wary of the enthymeme. And they like that because it's a great word, and it comes from Aristotle's rhetoric. It's, as you all know, it's a statement that connects two ideas, assuming that there is any logical connection or evidentiary connection between those two ideas. And so basically what I tell them to do is when you hear stuff like that, such as you have to fight like hell or you won't have a country. Well, what does that mean? So take it down the ladder of abstraction and ask yourself, how are these two connected at all, or are they? So what to do? What is the skill, or what we ask them to do is just be aware of this form of argument or message. Whether you hear it from your peers, whether you hear it from the social media, or you hear it from us as professors and instructors. Question us about the messages that we're putting out in class. And for yourself, and this is what I keep telling the students, is make up your own mind as opposed to relying on some media to make your mind up for you. Ask yourself the question, is there a credible evidence to support the major and minor premises? Because the word enthymeme, as you all know, comes from the syllogistic logic models. And finally, have greater trust in premises that include probabilities and evidence. And let me reemphasize that, probabilities and evidence, because most times we make certain statements. We say, well, it's possible that the election was stolen. But what's the probability of that occurring? Giving mountains of evidence. So we try to have the students make that differentiation. Is it possible or is it probable? Next slide, please. Be skeptical of not science, but be skeptical when somebody says the survey says or science proves. I also teach statistics. And basically what it comes down to is science doesn't prove anything. What science does in results, when you look at your literature, all of the articles and stuff that are in peer journals, is offer a probability that one hypothesis is supported or not. So when somebody says, oh, science proves, science has demonstrated with a pretty good probability that climate change does exist, but it's still a probability. And how much faith are you going to put in that probability? One more thing here, I'm looking at my time. Survey results. Surveys, to me, from a statistics point of view and from a critical thinking point of view, are rarely and glaringly misused in our public discourse. I really like what Dan said about one of the things that we do with critical thinking is have a more informed electorate. Here's the basic premise of any survey. The assumption is you have random selection. Random selection means that every individual that you define in this population has an equal probability of being selected. And most surveys, they don't discuss their methodology on how people were selected. So here are some things to think about. Next slide, please. The questions to ask about any survey, us as instructors and students as well. How did they sample respondents? Was it a random sample or was it convenience? What was their refusal rate? And this to me is a big thing that's never really discussed, is how many people did you contact that said, no, I'm too busy? Everybody on this call has received either a phone call on their cell phone or a text that says, ooh, would you participate in this simple survey because it's easier for the designers to have put surveys out on social media. How many of us click and say, oh yes, I'd love to do that? So what's the refusal rate? How many people were sampled? The larger the sample, as from statistically, the lower or the more precise the confidence intervals, that is the error rate. You look at things on the news, and what I tell the students is it's always in small numbers, but look at the error rate, plus or minus 4%. That means they had less than 300 people in the sample. Did they weigh the results and or impute data? If so, run. Be very skeptical. Weighting the data, as probably a lot of you know, is if you undersampled one group, you give them more weight in the results. And then there's a big thing in imputation, which is, well, this person didn't answer that question, but most of the people who did answer that question that were kind of like this person would have said this, and they put it in as instead of a missing number. And finally, who paid for it? Who paid for the survey? And were the questions biased or produced? So in summary, what I try to do is help students have little things that may be in there for whatever thinking that jump to mind when they hear claims. That can be a step towards critical thinking. And final slide, I think I do the final slide, maybe not. Oh yes, and you've all heard this. Ask if the claim is supported by sound argument or evidence. And one of the things that students, undergraduate students, like to grab onto because it's simple is the age-old rhetorical steps of ethos, pathos, and logos. Were you trying to be convinced because somebody had a logical argument, or it was your emotions, or because some important person said it? How am I doing? Probably about 2 more minutes. And I think is that the final slide, Ms. Isley? There we go. Yes, that's it. So in summary, what I try to do in terms of helping undergraduate students take steps towards critical thinking is make it simple. Give them little statements so that hopefully the hope is that they'll take the time to be uncomfortable and check what they see on AI and check what they're hearing on social media. So yeah, one final statement. Thank you, Sage, for giving me this opportunity. And I think anybody on this panel and anybody on the webinar, we owe a great deal of thanks to the Sage staff who put this together, because it's not an easy task. Thank you all. I yield.
And I think our next speaker is Dr. Brooklyn Gibson.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm just going to talk through a little bit of food for thought for y'all today. I don't have slides, but hopefully what I'm saying is engaging enough for y'all to follow. I am going to be speaking a little bit of counter to some of the things that folks have said earlier and in different panels. And I hope that's not received as being, antagonistic in any way. I just have a different way that I approach the issue of myths and disinformation and conspiracism. I am, as we said earlier, an assistant professor of communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And at Illinois, I teach graduate and undergraduate courses on race and digital studies. So if you know anything about students that self-select into classes that have race or gender in the title, you know they're coming in very interested in some complicated, difficult topics to talk about. So my advice is informed by that because I have to be sensitive to alternative epistemologies and different ways of knowing. I have to be sensitive to difficult classroom conversations that we're having, and also just being mindful of like the space and who's in the room. And so I'm of the school of Bell Hooks School of Engaged Pedagogy. I saw some folks in the chat saying that. And I do personally believe that like that is one of the best ways to teach. My students know that I'm human. I break down the walls of I'm a professor, you're down here. I'm not doing the banking model of learning. I'm actually using them as a part of the lessons within my classroom, which means that I get to know my students, I get to know their interests, and I incorporate them in my lectures. And that includes when we talk about mis and disinformation. So as a researcher, I think about how mis and disinformation circulates in Black social media spaces and why. And a lot of the times, one of the biggest misconceptions with folks is that they're uneducated or they just don't know anything. But what I found to be true is that people from disenfranchised backgrounds just have different ways of knowing that aren't typically honored in academia. So I have to acknowledge that. Even when I'm listening to students who may be saying something that I don't agree with or I know is not factual, I try to get at the root of why they think the way they do and how we can come to a common ground. And they usually do love that. I found students to be really excited when they feel like they're learning and growing. They often tell me that they're frustrated by all of the information and content that they're consuming online because there's so many different competing thoughts. They don't know what to think, and their K through 12 teachers haven't taught them how to think. And so that's what I tell them. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I don't want you to be a carbon copy of me and my beliefs, but I do want you to learn how to think. And in terms of thinking, I want to talk specifically for a second about AI because I did make some notes on that. I usually try to explain to my students how AI works. They typically don't know, and they've learned that they can trust certain search engines or others, and ChatGPT or whatever are a part of those tools they feel like they can use. But I always share with them the story, and I got this from professors Wendy Chung and Kara Keeling. They use the analogy of Narcissus and Echo from the Metamorphosis, Ovid's Metamorphosis, to talk about the way that a lot of these large language modeling systems work, and they're just repeating to you what's out there. So from our students who are writing papers about race and gender, I say, do you really want a computer to feed to you back what's out there when we know that people don't think about these topics, they're not talking about them critically? Do you really want your paper to be graded on the scale of what is popular in society? And so I typically go through them examples from my own research where I ask ChatGPT questions that everyone in the room knows the answer to, but because they're related to complex issues of race, ChatGPT is not pulling back the correct answers, or they just don't know about a thing. So as an example, and I wish I did have slides, I talk about the Old Mammy Memorial, or the movement to put a Mammy statue in Washington, D.C. as a monument to Black women who served people in slavery. This is something that's well documented in the Chicago Tribune. There's all these different organizations that work to get this done. The NAACP fought against it, but because it's not something popularly talked about in history, it doesn't come up in ChatGPT. So I usually just give them examples like that so that they can see it, and also talk them through the analogy of narcissists. I talk about sampling bias, labeling bias, historical bias, and underrepresentation bias. And what's most important and relevant to my students is that underrepresentation bias. Most of them know what it feels like to be underrepresented in a space. They know what it's like to be underrepresented in the history books, the textbooks. So it really resonates with them when I tell them, hey, this may not be something you want to replicate. You might want to be thinking about digging into writing your own papers around things that you're interested in, things that are not talked about a lot. And they usually get pretty excited about that task. And so in addition to that, I try to trouble this concept of media literacy, as I mentioned before, this idea that I, the teacher, know everything and you, the student, are just receiving from me. I think of myself as just a facilitator in the classroom. I'm giving students tools to talk through things. And so when I do that, I do honor what they're saying to me. So when in terms of engaged pedagogy, my students will talk to me about things on social media. I'm a social media researcher, so a lot of the times in Black digital social media spaces, I know what the conversations are. Right now, everybody's talking about the incident in Alabama, which is being taken up in Black social media spaces and also in white supremacist Reddit. And I can have that conversation with my students. And they feel comfortable coming to me because I've demonstrated them over and over again that I'm rooted in that space. And I think like creating that trust and also empowering students that they're their own people and that they can have their own ideas really yields a different type of vibe in the classroom that I think is personally very helpful. But to do this, we as librarians, educators, scholars, we also have to unlearn what we've learned about media literacy and bias. And so I'll leave y'all, because I'm just giving y'all some food for thought right now, on one example that I oftentimes give about a question that I'll ask students at the top of my class. I'll say, hey, if there's 3 birds in a tree, I take a stone, I throw it at one of the birds and knock that bird out of the tree. How many birds are in the tree? Now, science will teach you to treat this like a math project. It's logical. You knock one bird out of the tree, there's 2 left. But anybody who has the experiential knowledge of knowing what it feels like to throw a rock at a tree knows that there's no more birds in the tree, right? So we have to honor different approaches to coming to the same answer. And I found that from that moment on, moving forward, they kind of get that I get it. And we talk through these things over and over and over again as time goes on. And I found that they feel very disempowered because they feel like they're being talked down to as far as not knowing stuff. They're 18, they're 19. There's sometimes it's graduate students who are a little bit older. But I remember one student shared with me a meme that said, when the comments are disabled and I don't know what to think about the post. And it was really indicative of like how they're moving through the world not really knowing what to do with their being confronted. So I take social media posts and we deconstruct them. All of the steps that other folks have talked about in these panels, like going back to the source and measuring that out with some other things that we may know, that are the things that we do. And I also acknowledge the truths that they know to be true, right? A lot of students have been gaslit by their teachers, their professors, their communities about they're making things up and they're frantic, right? Like, you don't know science, you're just uneducated. When they've actually had to brush up against systems that were completely disenfranchising and racist towards them. So I always give the example of Flint, Michigan. There were all these conspiracies going around about what was going on with the water. They said that there were dead bodies in the water. They said that, the city was poisoning the water intentionally to, kill people. None of this stuff was true. But the reality of conspiracism is, don't drink the water. Like the reason why these conspiracies start is because they're trying to keep people protected when they're being disenfranchised from information. So when we take that point, then we can start really critically digging into things and talking about the facts. When I acknowledge the truth of what was happening, the thread of truth in that conspiracy, because we always know disinformation is truth mixed with lies together. We can then move forward and have a conversation about what was actually happening, what was found, what the details are, how, our president at the time was implicated in the cover up. We can have a full conversation about that. We can't do that until we start acknowledging and empowering learners. So if I say nothing else, I want to say that to y'all is that there is also another way that we have to critically think about the way we have come to know what critical thinking, media literacy, and conspiracism is and does. And we have to acknowledge and honor the people who have been disenfranchised by institutions that don't take their calls and cries for help seriously. And there's a way to do that and still honor the truth. So thank you. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Dr. Gibson. Dr. Richard Rosen.
Good morning, everybody. Well, at least it's morning where we are. After I took a look at the chat line and realized where everybody is in the world, it's afternoon, evening for a lot of people, but it's morning here. Let me just quickly tell you just briefly what I'm about so you'll understand where my comments are coming from. Like Brooke, I'm not going to use slides. I just want to have a conversation. I am as I think the information provides, I'm a retired professor. I'm 45 days into my retirement and I haven't flunked it yet. which is unusual because I did flunk my first retirement. I am a practicing lawyer, and then I got into education. And I got into education because I wanted to give back to my community, but more importantly, I thought I had experiences I wanted to share with people. And as a practicing lawyer, I mostly dealt with estate planning and tax, two incredibly boring areas, but areas that everybody, I'm sorry to tell you, you all will need at some point in your life. In the educational side, I just retired as the chair of the Personal and Family Financial Planning Program at the University of Arizona. And the courses that I teach, one is estate planning. And yes, for 16 weeks, we talk about people dying. That's how I lead off to talk to my students about it, because it's an experience that obviously they've not yet had. And then the other area I teach is professional conduct and fiduciary responsibility, or ethics on steroids. So critical thinking in my area is paramount to being successful. As an attorney, as an educator, you're only as good as your word, and you're only as good as what you represent is accurate. And so with that in mind, what I want to just kind of start off with, I want to take a quote from Bill Gates. And we all know Bill Gates is, the founder of Microsoft. And what he came out not too far, in the past said, AI is perhaps the most important advancement in technology since the personal computer. However, that technology can lead to pretty serious issues. As we all know, we have deep fakes, we have biased algorithms, and quite frankly, we are now starting to see vast cheating in schools. Is that new? No. I mean, I'm not done. Yes, I have a lot of wrinkles, white hair, but I have seen cheating throughout my life, even when I was in school. But that being said, it's really important for us to all understand there are some really positive impacts from AI. I'm a supporter. My students look at me and it's like, how can you be a supporter? You don't even understand how to use your smartphone. But I am a supporter of it. But we all have to remember there are some negative impacts that come out. But what I want everybody to understand, I'm holding up in my hand a HP 12C calculator. This thing was originated in 1981. I remember when calculators came into colleges and everybody panicked. We're going to totally forget how to add 2 + 2. We're going to forget our fractions. I also can remember when computers started to come into the classroom, and there was all kinds of negative things said about that. But as a professor, I can tell you, I can sit in front of my class and I can give an example to the students while they're there with their laptops or their tablets. And it's like, immediately hop online, tell me if this statement is correct. Computers have been a force in our classroom. Yes, it's changed the way we teach. It's changed the perspective that we have within the classroom. I think the same thing is happening with AI, and I hope it's happening with AI. But one of the things that we have to make sure we understand, it's the propensity for a lot of AI, not all of them, but for a lot of AI, just simply to make up facts. And that's conversation that has come out from many of the speakers before me. We need to make sure that we fully understand the difference. And sometimes your students look at you and scratch your head when you say, what's the difference between AI and a search engine? And they're going with the same thing. I'm searching for something. No, it's not necessarily true. A search engine, if you're just on Google or Bing or Yahoo, whatever you're using, and you want to find a restaurant, hop on there. You can search and you can find the information on it. I'll give you a map, give you the menu, whatever you want. But when we start to take a look at AI, and particularly generative AI, we are dealing with artificial intelligence that creates algorithms. And they can create text, they can create imagery or audio or synthetic data. And that's where we need to start paying attention. Because as we all know, these tools aren't perfect. And as we know, we have seen that they're not perfect. Let me, if I could, give you an example. This is in my past industry, in the legal industry. And this is a case some of you may have read about this recently. There was a case down in Texas, in the federal courts of Texas, and it happened to deal with an airline, and one of the carts that they have, food and drinks and everything, evidently got moved around and hit somebody and injured them. So that person was suing the airline for a personal injury lawsuit. The attorney representing the injured party went to ChatGPT and created the brief to submit to the court as part of the lawsuit. And what this attorney was looking for was case law. In the legal industry, what we do is we use previous cases that have been resolved through the court system. We use that as precedent. So if it's got similar facts, we present the cases to the court, and the court says, well, sure, this has happened, and therefore, you're guilty, or you've done what you've said you didn't do. Here was the problem with this case. The cases that came forward were bogus. Out of the 6 cases that were utilized to basically prove this attorney's case for his client, 2 of the cases never happened. Matter of fact, they were just made up words with bogus citation, bogus facts. All I can tell you, can you imagine, number one, the embarrassment to that attorney and probably the telephone call to his malpractice carrier, but more importantly, what the judge is doing. And the attorney admitted it, but this is my lead into misinformation or disinformation. Misinformation, as we all pretty much know, it's nothing more than inaccurate or some false information that you have picked up or that something has been presented to you. It's not necessarily something that somebody deliberately did or fraudulently did. There's a difference there. You made a mistake, it can be corrected. But when you start getting into disinformation, and we all have seen it, it is everywhere that you go right now. Disinformation, all of a sudden, you are getting false facts, false data, false information, comments, anything you might want to look at that has been put out to deliberately cause an issue, cause a problem, or to lead you astray. And the concern that we run into is that, and this may go to the educators and other folks here on this call or this webinar, but this goes to our students. We have to sit down with them and help them understand. Yes, it's one thing to go in and use generative AI or a search engine. It's acceptable to use that information. But boy, you better verify your facts. If you don't, you are doing yourself a disservice. One, because you're proving your critical thinking skills maybe not so good. But what you are also proving is you're sloppy. You are taking the easy path. And that's the concern that I have with AI. Like I said, I think it's a superb tool. And matter of fact, this past spring, as I was teaching my last estate planning course, I gave a case study to the students and I encouraged them. I want you to use AI for this case study. And the goal was to see what was produced. But I wanted them to tell me what they used, how they used it. And the assignment went off great. I mean, the case study, I got a whole bunch of different responses, as you might imagine. But one particular student, very upfront, used it in particular and used ChatGPT. Went through the case study, took the facts, inputted it. I'm not sure exactly how it was inputted, came back and gave him the exact wrong answer. I mean, literally, if this was an estate planning client and that was an attorney, that attorney just lost their license. It was that bad of a response. And so what we tried to do is we tried to figure out what happened. So this was going to be our verification. And as it turned out, it's what we sometimes call prompt engineering or keywords or key phrases. Wrong terminology was used. And we know, as at least right now, AI sometimes they'll latch on to certain keywords or certain prompts, and off it goes onto a tangent that sometimes is going down the wrong rabbit hole. And that's what happened in this case. But the proof in the pudding for me in my class, it was just this perfect learning moment. Please use AI, discover it, see what it's about, but let's make sure we verify what you're picking up out of the data. And the lesson that I learned there with the students, they're eager. And I know sometimes we kind of jump on our students and we say, you know what, they're going to get lazy. Yes, some of them will. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. But you are going to get some students who are so encouraged by new opportunities and new tools to further what their education is. Those are the students who fully understand and grasp the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and that critical need to verify everything that you gather from that research. So, you know, as I kind of finish up here, I just want to give one last example. This was a little bit further ago. I think a lot of you may have seen this. Target, the big Target store, a lot of us may go shopping there. They use their own proprietary algorithms. And essentially what Target has done is they take the data that has been inputted from credit cards on their own sales and that type of thing. And based upon that data, they can pretty much determine, and in this particular case, determine whether or not somebody is pregnant. And this actually happened. And they determined this shopper happened to be pregnant. And so they started sending out all these coupons for all these baby goods. The problem was that young lady hadn't quite told her mother and father that she was pregnant. She happened to be using the parents' credit card. And so the other thing sometimes we need to be a little bit careful about is what's happening. And a number of our speakers have talked about this. What's happening with the privacy of our data? And that's the other real concern that can come, you know, you put that together with the misinformation or disinformation, you can have some real problems. I've given you two very, very short, simple examples. Trust me, there's a ton of them out there. But what I just want to leave with everybody, critical thinking is the way I look at it. Critical thinking, we need to be objective. We need to make sure we're dealing with facts, not with opinions. And the one thing I want to just kind of say as I finish up here, how many times if somebody you have gone in a conversation or been dealing with a governmental entity or dealing with your administrators at your institution have said, it's our policy. Here's the only thing I want you to understand. If it's not in writing, it's somebody's opinion. And in most cases, opinions are not worth the paper they're printed on. So let me sign off there. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. And yeah, I may be retired, but I'm not brain dead yet. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dan, Dr. Gibson, Dr. Wood, and Dr. Rosen for a fantastic second session, which has really prompted lots of engagement, reflection, and discussion in the chat. And that was really a masterclass in how Bootcamp can get excellent questions and discussions going. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions today, but as we said before, we will make sure that all of your questions are answered and that the answers to those questions are circulated after the event. We will now have a 5-minute break, and please feel free to get up, stretch, top up your cool summer refreshment and get prepared for our last panel session. On screen, you'll notice a fresh new trivia question. Please dive in with your own responses and reflections. It's always so helpful to see various perspectives. And we'll begin our final session shortly. So we're back in 5 minutes at 25 past. Hi everybody and welcome back. I'm just going to take a moment while everybody joins before we get going with our third and final panel event. So I hope everybody is refreshed and ready for our third and final panel event today. What your students want from AI and what they want you to know. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Morris, a PhD student at the University of Alabama, Dr. Brady Beard, reference and instruction librarian at Emory University, Anne Lester, a student at Emory University, and Hannah Pearson, a recent Master of Fine Art graduate of the University of South Carolina. Again, you can learn more about all of our speakers on the event page. Over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for hanging in here for the last session of the day. I'm excited to be on this panel for a couple of different reasons, so I'll go ahead and dive in here. I think I have some slides that will be showing up momentarily. But my name's Sarah Morris, and I am, like many on this panel, kind of wearing, I think, a dual hat at the moment. So I'm pursuing my PhD and furthering my studies, but I've also been an academic librarian for 10 years. And so like many here, I'm also wearing the hat of being a teacher and preparing my own classes, as well as being in classes right now, which I think can hopefully provide some interesting perspective on this topic in question. A little about me and sort of my background and where I'm kind of coming from and approaching this. As I mentioned, I've been an academic librarian for 10 years, mostly working with undergraduate students. However, in recent years, I've had the opportunity to work on some different projects that have let me work with adult learners and non-traditional students, as well as high school students. And it's been really interesting to see the common questions and also shared concerns around topics like AI, as well as divergences among these groups when it comes to AI. I think, again, the dual perspective many of us have on this panel can be quite valuable since students, faculty, librarians, and others are all part of a shared community of learning. So I certainly hope we can reflect on ways to listen and learn from one another as we're all grappling with the implications of AI, not just on education, but on sort of our daily lives, on society writ large, and on the different tools and technologies we use to engage with and communicate with one another. If we can have the next slide, please. So there's certainly, and as have been brought up in the previous fantastic panels, a lot of implications regarding AI in terms of, teaching and learning. So not just what we're teaching, so new topics that are perhaps needing to come up in our classes, reflecting on AI's implications on teaching and research and writing and critical thinking and how these things work, but also how we're going about teaching. So how can these tools be utilized in our work, whether we're coming as students, as educators, we're doing research, we're writing, how can all these things sort of come into play? So a couple of questions that have sort of come up for me around this, and I know my other panelists are going to be considering here today. How can we consider both what students sort of want and need around AI, sort of at the current moment and in the future, which I'll come back to in a second. For instance, students, and having begun this journey myself again, I can understand this, might want to say, finish an assignment as quickly as possible. We've all been there. I understand that. Perhaps Bard or ChatGPT can help with that endeavor. So that could be perhaps a want that's emerging. But there also are lots of needs around understanding how AI works. So why are you seeing what you're seeing? How do these tools actually function? What are the limitations and possibilities of these resources? How can they be used effectively? What are the ethical implications of using these things? And how can your own individual critical thinking skills be leveraged? So lots of questions, I think, and considerations, both from students' needs and wants. And in relation to that, I think it's also really important to consider the wants and needs of, say, faculty and librarians as well, and how we're all grappling with AI in our research and our teaching, and where can all of these things intersect and also diverge in terms of these learning communities we're all a part of. There was very interesting piece in The Guardian a couple of months back around getting back to sort of AI hallucinating things, but a student in the UK contacted The Guardian trying to verify a citation. It turns out that they got the citation from ChatGPT. ChatGPT had hallucinated the citation. However, the journalist they accredited it to was a real person who did admit they've written similar sounding articles before, just not that particular one. So it was an interesting piece about everyone involved sort of grappling with the implications of this and what ChatGPT had done, sort of how the student was trying to use it, how the journalist felt being pulled into this conversation, and, you know, kind of getting at sort of what might be kind of going on with these tools, what are sort of the possibilities and limitations there. So certainly an interesting case study example. If you want to check that out, I can add that in the chat later. So what I'd like to do is consider both sort of current and future wants and needs, as I mentioned earlier. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so I broke this into two parts because I do think there's different questions that can sort of arise around the sort of present moment and perhaps future moment for our students that are well worth considering and listening to their thoughts and experiences around this. So first is considering current wants, needs, and questions arising around AI. And this focuses more on sort of the current experiences of students as students. So for example, this might get at things like their current coursework or things they're having to do in their classes or, you know, policies and procedures. Some questions that have come up for me here that I know the other panelists are going to dive into in more detail. One, of course, is the increased need for AI literacy, which we've been hearing about a lot today, and people have spoken very eloquently on, and is certainly an important thing to consider. Going back to that previous example from, say, The Guardian, or just thinking of a student trying to maybe utilize these tools in their assignment or think about them, there's so many questions around how, again, these things work, the possibilities and the limitations of AI, and having that literacy to think critically, to ask questions, to delve into, for instance, the power dynamics of how these things are developed, privacy issues, ethical issues, you know, again, possibilities and limitations. I've been really interested to see lately so much of the, you know, discussion of sort of the news coverage itself of AI, and how this can get sort of, you know, overblown or doomsday, or on the flip side, very utopian visions of it, and sort of navigating these conversations we're all having around these things. I saw an article in The Atlantic a while back where it was talking about the impact of AI on higher education, and the banner image they chose to use was of some sort of robot with laser eyes. It looked like a Cylon from Battlestar Galactica, if anyone kicks it old school, wearing a graduation cap and sort of staring menacingly. So that kind of framing of this conversation, I think, is worth considering as well. So again, AI literacy is increasingly essential, and lots of questions about how can we empower students with these skills? Where can these conversations and opportunities occur? I'm obviously biased towards libraries, but thinking about campus-wide, what should we be equipping students with? How can we have these conversations? Related to this, though, I think a lot of students also have questions around the use of AI and sort of potentially policies around this. For those of us in libraries, I'm sure we've all had the experience of a student coming in and having a lot of questions about citations and really wanting to do that correctly, and having perhaps concern around their assignment and wanting to do that effectively. And I think we might start seeing similar things around questions of, is it okay if I use BARD in this way, or what's acceptable here, or how does this impact sort of plagiarism policies on campus? So those kinds of questions, as well as their current experiences as students and the coursework they're doing. One other thing I'll just mention here is a lot of these sort of, I think, questions around things like AI literacy and how can we explore and interrogate and navigate these issues around AI with our students is having me recall certain other moments where we might have been asking similar questions regarding technological developments, or how can we empower students as researchers, or help them think critically about the technologies and tools they're using on a daily basis. For example, things like algorithmic literacy has come up for many librarians. There's always, I think, been questions around how can we help students understand how academic databases work, or library search engines, and how that might differ from tools like Google that students are used to, so that they have that knowledge they can use as researchers. So are there ways to deal with assumptions we might have about our students, or they might have about where we're coming from, identifying knowledge gaps as well, and just, again, creating those spaces to have those conversations as a full learning community around everyone's kind of experiences and questions around AI. Next slide, please. All right, so just very briefly, I did want to kind of break out some of these future considerations. So, and as opposed to maybe current questions students might have about, again, their experiences as students, their coursework, things like that. A lot of students, and I think people in general, certainly have a lot of questions around the world of work and the workforce, and the implications AI might have on job prospects and things like this. So are there, ways we can equip students to explore these issues and perhaps feel a little better prepared, or set them up as lifelong learners? Are there potentially gaps in current programming around AI where we can sort of address some of these issues? And finally, are there just ways to better connect to our students and their lived experiences, their particular concerns, and their own interest around AI, and create space for these conversations to happen, which I think libraries can certainly play an important role there. Final slide, please. Awesome. All right, so just some closing questions before I hand it over to the other people on this panel. I think AI, we're living in a really interesting moment where AI is something we all have a lot of questions and uncertainty about, and is sort of every day there's new things coming out, or new implications, or new questions and concerns. So it's not just students, but faculty and librarians all kind of considering this in this moment together. So again, I think the final kind of through line for this panel for me is, how can we explore these topics together and better engage with our students around AI and its implications and related topics? So with that, I believe I'm handing it off to Dr. Brady Beard, who's a fantastic former colleague of mine. So go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you to so many wonderful people at SAGE for organizing this event and making it run smoothly. I do not have any slides today. I'm just going to talk with you all a little bit about sort of where my thoughts are on this topic. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Brady Beard. I am the Reference and Instruction Librarian at Pitt's Theology Library at Emory University. And here I work with professional and graduate students across the various schools at Emory. And you might be wondering what a theological librarian has to say or to think about generative artificial intelligence or large language models. But I hope that my thoughts this morning are a bit instructive on this topic. I think at the core, for me, one of the connecting points is that in so much as the study of religion and theology in an academic setting is sort of exploring what people think is sort of out there or beyond them, right? It's also very much the study of who people are and how they understand themselves. And I think for me, this is sort of the main point. I really liked the language earlier that Dr. Mejia used about the humans in the loop of this new information landscape that we find ourselves in. And so a lot of my thinking is, I think, summed up by these thoughts. And it's also on the sort of ethical issues that face the end user of all of these various programs that we've talked about. I am a recent graduate of a doctoral program, as you might have gathered, but I'm also currently enrolled as a student in the MLIS program at the University of Alabama here in the United States. So also sort of actively thinking about these things, as Sarah mentioned, both as a student and practitioner and teacher in all of these identities. So my first sort of line of thinking has to do with the way that these new systems are changing our previously existing information systems and the ways that we access information and sort of begin a research process. And just by way of anecdote, I, over the last semester, had several occasions where I was sitting at the reference desk and interacting with researchers who brought to me various citations that they had a hard time finding, only to begin sort of, as I began searching and helping them, begin suspecting that the references that I had in front of me were in fact generated by an AI system. Some of these were very sophisticated, right? Some of these had annotations that went with them, right? Some of these were bibliographies that had already been approved by an instructor, right? In an attempt maybe to scaffold the assignments. And we've already heard about some of the problems related to that. And one of them is that it's not that these were totally made up or hallucinated items, right? It was more of a mishmash of things that were out there in the world. A real scholar, a real journal, a real academic journal, a title that sounds very convincing, real page numbers, right? And all of these things sort of combined together in a list of items that some of the items on the bibliography were real, right? That I recognized, and some of them weren't. And in that moment, as someone working directly with a student or a researcher, you sort of have the opportunity to say, where did you get this citation? Because I can't find it anywhere. This is the closest I can come to it, right? And there's a moment, I think, a moment of honesty between librarian and student in many ways, or librarian and researcher, that sort of comes, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of trust that must be built, right? In many ways, as a librarian, I get to be a non-evaluative source of information for a researcher. So I can say, well, this is wrong, and they don't have to worry about receiving a grade from me on the topic. But in many other ways, there's also a sort of societal embarrassment, right? That I don't want to cause the other person to have by straight up accusing them of using ChatGPT. So I think finding ways to talk about these generative tools that are now at our fingertips is really important. I also want to echo some things that I heard earlier today, that many of the problems that arise from the sort of AI landscape right now is not entirely new, right? I mean, to me, in many ways, AI is sort of ChatGPT or Bard or something like this is sort of a worse version of a ghostwriter that somebody might hire to write, a term paper for them or something. In many ways, these are not new challenges, but they are new ways into the challenges. And the bottom line on this for me is that for every student that is sort of failing forward with generative AI, right, and running into phony references and these sorts of things, there are many, many others that are using these tools well and in sophisticated ways, much more sophisticated ways than probably many of us on this call are willing to admit. And so I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that we're not talking about a future that is upcoming, but we're talking about a reality that is already here. And that is our students are already using generative AI, and they're probably using it in ways that are far more sophisticated and better than most of us, whether we're librarians or faculties members, are even aware of. With that, I think it's important that we begin to reframe the sort of conversation around plagiarism and intellectual honesty. And I really appreciate Dr. Punn's presentation earlier today, where he sort of helped us to start rethinking some of these issues, as well as Dr. Gibson's sort of comments on pedagogy. My own sort of take and my own sort of understanding, at least from the vantage point of being at the reference desk and being that sort of non-evaluative person that gets to talk to students about their research, is that most students aren't interested in using these systems for cheating, right? They know better than that. I think where a lot of the sort of turning to a lot of the generative AI systems comes from is from a place of a lack of understanding what's being required of them. And often this falls on the faculty member, right, to clearly state what it is that students are being expected to do and to explain how that work will be assessed. These are a lot of times, these are the same motivations that sort of empower students to turn to a system like Google instead of, say, a library database, right? Even though the students might know that the database is maybe better or has more information that they can use, Google is just there. It's a little bit more easily accessible. They can use it in ways, right, that they can't necessarily use the library catalog. So ultimately, I think plagiarism is the wrong way to frame this conversation. Of course, it's technically difficult, if not impossible, to prove with a lot of these generative systems. It's also not the way that most people outside of higher ed are going to begin engaging with these generative platforms. I have a colleague far outside of higher ed who uses them to help with writing reports and emails and things like that. And so I think an openness to what could be done with these systems is needed. So I would encourage faculty and librarians to not only think about what are students using AI for now, but also what are they going to be using them for in the future, right? Task completion, research, generative purposes, all of that. Finally, that means that we have to adjust our assessments in higher ed, I think. And this is where, as a student myself, I'm happy to speak to really good experiences that I've had in the classrooms recently. In fact, had a course through the University of Alabama, and the faculty member required an oral examination at the end of the course instead of a written exam. And part of his justification for that was that, you can't really AI your way out of an oral exam when you're sitting in a Zoom call with someone face to face. And I will say, in all my years of being in the classroom, that is the only classroom setting, outside of my comprehensive exams and defenses and things for my doctoral work, where I was invited to participate in an oral examination. And as a student, I found it a really rewarding way to engage the material that we had learned. It was also really nice that I knew it was going to be the preparation and then 15 or 20 minutes with the faculty member, and I wasn't going to be spending, maybe all night or several nights writing the term paper. Lastly, I just want to say, I saw this comment in the chat, and I have more to say on this, but in the interest of time, I'll end here. As we think about sort of where the humans are in the loop of this whole new system that we find ourselves in, I think it's important that we as librarians and faculty do what we can to remind people that these systems are not magic, right? There is a human cost behind all of them. There's a human role. And I saw it in the chat, but I just want to echo it here. Even using language of hallucinating or making up, right, ascribes a certain agency to these systems that don't have them. And so part of the turn that I think we need to be making and that I would advocate for is a turn toward a sort of critical AI literacy, one that understands and can investigate the context, the production, the dissemination, the reception of information in these platforms, as well as being suspicious of that sort of agency that we are tempted to ascribe to something that ultimately doesn't have any agency outside of the humans on the other side of the algorithm or on the other side of the training software. So all that to say, I don't think we need to all become AI experts. And in fact, in many ways, I don't think that's possible, right? Not just because of time, but also because of the black boxes that sort of construct all of these systems. But I do think that we need to start asking questions about the implications, not just of the research impacts, but also of the costs for how that information gets to us and where our students will be in the future as they move into a world that is increasingly becoming a place where these systems and tools are being used in day-to-day life. And so with that, I end, and I think I hand it over to Hannah or Anne. I'm not sure which, I'm sorry.
That's my name on the screen, so I'm going to assume it's me. Thanks to everyone who's already spoken and who has contributed questions, not just the panelists, but as well as the audience here. This back and forth, the dialogue has been really fun to follow and learn from, and even kind of rethink some of my own comments for today throughout. I do know that we are running a little short on time, and I know that Hannah's got some really insightful things to say, so I'm gonna speed through a little bit. One of the nice things about going toward the end is that everyone else has already said things so eloquently that I don't necessarily have to rehash everything. I had, when I was approached about this, doing this panel by Brady, who I have studied from at Emory, I had 3 major questions that kind of came up, having to do with references and citations, what a teacher should be looking for in order to best help their students, and what it looks like moving forward for students to be using AI in the classroom. This next slide that I have is references and citations specifically, but I do think that we've had a lot of really good conversation about that already, rethinking plagiarism and kind of what we think that students are even going to AI for. Like Brady said, we're not using AI thinking that we're going to be cheating and getting away with something, right? Especially once you're getting kind of into these higher education, master's, PhD programs. We're all at the very least smart enough to know better, and potentially sometimes at the most maybe a little bit too arrogant to even want to try. We want to believe that we can come up with something better than what AI can 99% of the time, and I'm not sure that that's true 99% of the time. But I'll go ahead, since so much has been said on that already, I'll go ahead and skip to the next slide. And this, I think, is kind of the biggest question that I have in reference to AI in the classroom, is what we are doing so that our teachers and our professors and our instructors are also learning. Because this is something that is so new and it's something that is ever changing, it's not something that, like Brady said, anybody can be an expert on all at once, or potentially should even try to. And so I just had this idea over and over again of, as a teacher, yes, I want you to in some ways be the expert. But more than that, I think I want to recognize in a teacher that they are learning alongside me, and that we are in a conversation of, what is this technology? What are we doing with it right now? But what can we do with it to kind of maximize its potential in our own research? I just this last semester was in a class regarding AI and theology, and what technology looks like, not just in a classroom setting, but also in a church setting. And while I learned a lot from the class in and of itself, and philosophy and theology and all of that, of course, really there were so many things that at a base level I hadn't even heard of were resources at all. And so I think as a student, having someone who isn't necessarily an expert, but who can kind of get me in at a base level, and kind of just introduce me to these things, in a way that is not making that assumption that, I'm now going to go use this to make a list of citations that are all fake, or write all of my papers for me from here on out, but in a way that is saying, hey, here's a resource. These are the things that you can do with it. Maybe still be careful about the way that you're using it, but this does exist. And that moves into, if I can get my next slide here, what academia responds to these changes in AI. And I think that moving forward, we're going to see that it's not an option to limit AI's use. I think that there will be things that obviously need to be set, kind of rules or laws, if you will, of AI in academia. But I think that we're moving toward a place where students who are not aware of AI and the way that it can be used in research will actually be hugely disadvantaged from students who are aware of these tools and these resources and know how to best use them. And so having teachers and fellow students who are educated in AI, in ChatGPT, in kind of this idea of hallucination and finding the disinformation and parsing what is useful and what is just kind of noise becomes really, really vital for students and researchers who already are taking 20 credit hours and maybe don't have the time to figure every single wiki page out on our own. And so I think that ultimately for me, it is this hand in hand. We are all learning together and we're building something. And I think that that's something that's really exciting. And I think that it's something that we all kind of look at AI and think about the robot revolution. But I think that if we look at it through this lens of creation, that we have a lot more possibilities than I think we have right now in our imagination. And I know that was quick, but I want to toss this over to Hannah so that we can hear everything that she's got to say as well.
All right, thank you so much, Anne. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Pearson. I'm a 2023 graduate of the University of South Carolina's MFA Creative Writing program, and I'm also a corporate communications intern here at SAGE. Today, I'm going to talk with you about generative AI and content creation in the classroom. In particular, I'm responding to Sarah's question about how to better connect to our students' lived experiences and concerns related to AI. Next slide, please. So I've heard the word content several times throughout this webinar, which excites me. And I want to start by defining content and content creation. So content creation is the process of producing, publishing, and sharing digital content. This content can be visual, oral, written, or multimodal. And examples include blog posts, YouTube videos, podcasts, and all sorts of social media content and more. The term content creator is often interchanged with the word influencer. To be clear, most influencers are content creators, but not all content creators are influencers. Sometimes people like to stick their nose up at content creation, and perhaps rightly so. But if you've ever tweeted about a conference or written a lengthy LinkedIn post or contributed to an online publication, then you too have dabbled in content creation. And we're living in a world where more and more people in all fields are expected to engage with the creator economy. I have been in editorial acquisitions meetings for trade and academic publishers where a prospective author's Twitter following and web presence were real contributing factors to publishing that author. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give some more context about content creation and how it relates to students. HubSpot's 2023 Consumer Trends Report, published in March of this year, found that 30% of surveyed adults ages 18 to 24 considered themselves to be content creators. That number goes up to about 40% for the age 25 to 35 age group. This is significant because 18 to 24 is the traditional college age for students in the United States. Another relevant study to think about, this made headlines in 2019 and was conducted by LEGO and the Harris Poll to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing. Up until then, polls continuously found that American children wanted to be astronauts when they grew up. But this study found that 29% of surveyed American children between the ages of 8 and 12 wanted to be YouTubers. In other words, they wanted to be content creators. Only 11% of students surveyed in that poll said they wanted to be astronauts. Next slide, please. So to provide further context to this idea of content creation, let's talk for a moment about how the creator economy is perceived. For years, the creator economy has been considered recession-proof, which was put to the test during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many headlines and content creators declared that the creator economy was also apparently pandemic-proof. This was due to the fact that many content creators made a lot of money during the pandemic. This may be because the creator economy promotes remote work, flexibility, and independence, which we value even more now after the experiences of COVID-19. Significantly, something else that the creator economy has promoted is an embrace of generative AI. Next slide. So considering the context surrounding content creation, it's clear that content creation has been a part of many students' imaginations from a young age. Students are already immersed in this world of content creation. And as I said, the creator economy has also embraced generative AI. The creator economy is often about generating good content quickly, no matter how it is produced. Generative AI drastically decreases the time it takes to outline a YouTube video, organize a blog post, or write adequate social media copy. As Dr. Beard just mentioned, people working outside of academia approach generative AI as a tool rather than in terms of plagiarism or ethics. And depending on the course you teach, especially if you teach undergraduates, the reality is that the majority of your students will be seeking employment outside of academia. Next slide, please. So what I recommend with all of that in mind is employing some of the strategies learned by other panelists in this session or in this webinar and approaching students as content creators. Using generative AI to create content in the classroom gives students the chance to connect skills like research, fact-checking, academic writing, and critical thinking to the familiar world of content creation. In other words, embracing generative AI in the classroom allows students to feel like the content creators they already consider themselves to be, whether they're actively part of the creative economy or not. Next slide. In treating students like content creators and embracing generative AI in the classroom, we can tap into the critical thinking skills that students have already developed as content creators. Content creation requires critical thinking skills and a strong grasp of the rhetorical situation, including those basic rhetorical appeals that Dr. Wood mentioned earlier, the pathos, ethos, and logos. A content creator must develop a strong sense of digital literacy and technical skills to produce, publish, and distribute their content. Simply running an active Instagram account now requires basic graphic design and video editing skills. Content creators must be aware of the audience they are trying to reach, and students who create this content are very aware of the language used by whatever discourse community they're trying to connect with. Content creation, whether at the professional or amateur level, requires content creators to set goals and practice project management skills. I don't know if you've ever watched an undergraduate try to make a TikTok video, but they will devote considerable time and effort to making it perfect before hitting publish. And while it seems easy to dismiss these skills, they are marketable and professional. I personally have been rejected from communication and marketing jobs because I have never touched TikTok, and companies know the value of such content. Content creation also involves an awareness of social impact. There's often a strong belief in connecting with others, sharing information, and building a community. Last slide, please. So if you're wondering what content creation in the classroom might look like or how to integrate it into your syllabus, I'll give some examples. First, I recommend asking what content you can ask your students to produce, or what content are you actually already asking them to produce. As I mentioned, I have an MFA in creative writing and my BA was in English, Deaf Studies, and American Sign Language. So creative projects were very, very common in the classes I took and the classes I taught. Examples include podcasts, group presentations, multimedia projects, and more. Another example involves adapting academic writing and academic research into other genres for specific audiences. A paper arguing for the use of American Sign Language in young children, for example, might be turned into a digital media project aimed at elementary school teachers, hearing parents of deaf children, legislators, audiologists, and more. And generative AI could be used to brainstorm, structure, organize, and edit such content. So in this way, I think AI can help students bridge the gap between research and research impact. So my final word, by approaching students as content creators and mimicking the creator economy's use of generative AI, we can tap into students' existing critical thinking skills, rhetorical awarenesses, and creativity, and give them a valuable classroom experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Dr. Beard, Anne, and Hannah for a fantastic final session. that was a really appropriate sort of ending to our bootcamp. We are stuck for time, so we don't have time to sort of answer any questions, but we will make sure those questions are answered and circulated. There is just one question here that I'd like to pose to you all, though, and this might seem unfair at the end of your session, but if you could just give me a quick answer, maximum of 2 sentences, that would be great. And the question is, if AI hadn't been invented, would you want it to be invented, and why? The quick answers from you all, if that's okay, to finish us off for the day.
I don't know that I would have wanted it to be invented, but nevertheless, here we are, right? And it's still early, so who knows? Maybe I would change my mind in the future.
I think I would echo you, Brady. I'm not sure I would say yes, invented, but yeah, we're here with it now, and my hope is we can take it in a positive direction for everyone and not have some sort of killer robot revolution. We'll close out on that. Anne and Hannah, go for it.
It's a yes and no for me, I think. I think that I don't know that I can imagine my life without Siri. But I also think that I can't imagine my life without deepfakes, you know? So I think that there are some kind of AI that we don't necessarily think of as out there because it's so ingrained in our lives now, that I think that it would be hard to say, no, I don't want any of it, at the risk of saying, no, I don't want all of it.
I'm going to say yes, and I'm also going to say no.
Thank you so much for a fantastic day. I just want to thank all of our presenters and all of our speakers for the time, insight, and practical advice that they've so generously shared today. Hats off to all of you for prompting so much great discussion and so much great questions and so much great reflection as well. I also wanted to thank each of you for attending and actively participating in this year's Critical Thinking Bootcamp. Good questions underpin critical thinking. So thank you to everyone who has jumped in on the Q&A and started lots of great discussion. Your contribution has really helped us deliver another fantastic event. And I hope that each of you feel geared up for the full term to continue this conversation. We will send you an email in the coming weeks to share a recording of today's session and our toolkit as well to help you and your students start thinking critically. If you have any feedback for us, then please don't hesitate to email us. You can reach us at pr@sagepub.co.uk, and we really would love to hear from you. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.